Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome to Audit Committee. If you could take your seats, we'll start in about 1 minute. On va commencer dans 1 minute. Carole, we're good. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome to the Audit Committee meeting for today, May 29th. Let's get right to the agenda. Do we have any declarations of interest? Seeing none, confirmation of minutes for the last meeting, which was on April 8th, 2019. Good. Carried. Thank you very much. 3 agenda items today. Item number 1, consolidated financial statements, les états financiers de la Ville d'Ottawa pour 2018. We have guests from Ernst & Young who will have a presentation, and from our staff who will have a presentation. Let's hold this item. Item number 2, the sinking fund financial statement. There is no presentation on that, and there's no speakers. No. And there are no speakers. Is that anyone have any questions on that item? And that item is carried. Thank you very much. And item number 3, the Office of the Auditor General, le Bureau du Vérificateur Général, will have a report and a presentation. And also note that we absolutely expect to resolve in camera for an item further to that report, just so you know. So back to item number 1, city financial statements, and I will ask our guests to provide us with their presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will present the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2018. We also have Ernst & Young with us today, Susie Guignac, the EY partner responsible for this audit, and the audit manager, Lisa Godin. They are here to present the results of the audit after I've made my presentation. Nous avons aujourd'hui Ernst & Young qui vont présenter les résultats de leur vérification des états financiers à la conclusion de ma présentation des résultats pour l'année fiscale du 31 décembre 2018. So the city's financial status remains strong. We are reporting a surplus for the year ended December 31st, 2018 of $609 million, which is different from the $19 million surplus reported at the end of 2018 for budget purposes. Financial statements are reported based on Canadian public sector accrual accounting standards, whereas the budget is reported on a modified cash basis. Their surplus is higher on an accrual basis because it recognizes the revenue that are not included on a cash or budget basis, such as assets contributed from developers and the share of earnings from hydro. Also, on an accrual basis, expenses include the annual depreciation of the historical cost of assets, which tends to be lower cost than what is contributed to capital annually on a budget basis to replace these assets. The city's overall accumulated surplus increased by $613 million in 2018. Most of that increase is due to the annual surplus. Overall net debt has increased, but so has the value of non-financial assets. This reflects the increased investment in capital. Our net debt is $2.2 billion, but this is offset by total non-financial assets of $16 billion. This represents the amount to service future generations and includes our tangible capital assets and reserves less future liabilities. Accounts receivable increased primarily due to receivables from the federal and provincial levels of government for public transit infrastructure funding, PTIF, and the combined water-wastewater funding. Investment in government business enterprise represents the net assets for Hydro Ottawa, which we report on our financial statements on an equity basis. The city received dividends from Hydro Ottawa in the amount of $22 million in 2018 related to results from 2017 operations. On the liabilities side, we had an increase in accounts payable and accrued liabilities, which included additional payables for Confederation Line, as well as additional accruals for brownfields relating to the Zibi development on the Ottawa River. Deferred revenue primarily includes the development charges collected but not spent yet on projects that were intended to fund. In 2018, there was an increase in the collection of development charges and a decrease in the development charge transfers to projects, which resulted in an overall increase in the development charge deferred revenue. The next slides will provide additional details on the next two major items, which is employee future benefits and pensions and the net long-term debt. So employee future benefits increased this year. These liabilities represent benefits earned but not payable until future years. The amount payable in the current year is budgeted for each year and changes primarily because of changes in actuarial assumptions and legislation. This future liability is an estimation and may or may not reflect the actual amounts that could be paid in that future. The most significant changes include post-retirement and post-employment benefits. The increase by $39 million mainly due to an increase in long-term disability claims and post-retirement benefits. These increases were offset by a $5 million reduction to workplace safety and insurance board premiums and a $3 million reduction in the liability for the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund. Our net long-term debt decreased by the amount of the 2018 debt principal payments. There was no new debt that was issued in 2018, as the planned 2018 debt issue was advanced and combined with the 2017 debt issuance in order to reduce the cost impact of increasing interest rates. When you look at the debt level compared to the total cost of the city's gross assets, it represents 8.9% of those assets. That's the equivalent of a $35,000 mortgage on a $400,000 home. Principal and interest payments are restricted in two ways. Council has established specific targets for debt and whereby principal and interest payments for tax and rate-supported debt are not to exceed a combined target of 8.5% of the city's own source revenue. In 2018, this percentage was 5.96%. The provincial measure looks at the cost of debt issued, including mortgages as a percentage of own source revenues, and that limit is 25%. In 2018, this measure is calculated at 8.2%, which is far below the provincial limit. Compared to other large municipalities, Ottawa continues to have one of the lowest total debt per capita. The overall value of the assets based on cost increased by $988 million in 2018. The most significant construction projects contributed to the increase is the Confederation Line Stage 1. This is reported under assets under construction. It was for the value of about $156 million. Confederation Line Stage 2 also reported in assets under construction of $123 million. Roads, $222 million. Water, wastewater, infrastructure, $294 million. And I just want to state that the roads number also includes things like bridges and culverts, so it's not just roads. We classify other assets within that category. As you can see from the chart, water and wastewater infrastructure makes up 28% of the total tangible capital asset net book value. That's the conclusion of my presentation.
Are there any questions to city staff? But I'm sure after the E&Y presentation, Isabel will still be available if that provides context. So no questions for the time being?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to present as a partner on the audit for the City of Ottawa. I'm going to present our audit results related to the financial statements. At a high level, we are substantially complete the audit. We do continue our procedures until June 12th, which is the date when Council will actually approve the financial statements. So we will inform the committee if anything is identified in that period. You'll see in the financial statements our draft audit opinion, which is an unmodified opinion. We have a clean audit opinion in those financial statements at this point in time. It has changed in its structure, if you look at it, so that the actual audit report, the opinion now comes first, and then the basis of opinion, and then management and the auditor's responsibilities. So if you look at it, it has changed, and just wanted to let you know that. So moving into our presentation, from an audit perspective, we did conduct the audit in line with what we had planned. Our materiality was set at 2% of expenditures, and it remained at that level for the audit. We did have a dual audit where we relied on controls in some areas and performed substantive audit in other areas. We performed control testing and relied on controls over the IT general controls for SAP and for MarkView. And we did controls testing over the purchases, payables, payment stream, as well as the payroll stream. And we're able to rely on those controls. So the areas of audit emphasis are generally a lot of the larger line items on the financial statements, as well as those areas where there are significant estimates. The first is the revenue recognition. This is a very significant line item at $4.1 billion in total revenue. We look at different types of revenue. We do substantive analytic procedures as well as detailed testing of large balances and a random sample of transactions. And we look at taxation revenue, development charges, and how that's being recorded as revenue, user fees and charges, as well as government transfers, and ensure they're being accounted for in line with the standards. Contingent liabilities is a second area of emphasis. In particular, we look at management and legal counsel's assumptions for contingent legal liabilities, and we confirm with both in-house legal counsel as well as external legal counsel to get comfortable over the assumptions being made and the accruals being made related to those liabilities. Investments in financial instruments is another area of focus. They're very significant at the city at approximately $1.2 billion. So we do confirm that the investments exist with the custodian. We look at the market value of those investments as well as the carrying value of them. And we look at whether there are any impairments that would be required to be recognized on the financial statements. And we didn't identify any issues. Another area of focus is employee future benefits. There are a lot of assumptions in employee future benefits, and we obtain the actuarial evaluation from the city's actuaries, and we actually have in-house actuaries as well that review the actuarial evaluation. We look at the specific assumptions around the OC Transpo pension plan, the COSF, superannuation fund, post-employment and retirement benefits, as well as the WSIB accrual. We did identify two differences which were not adjusted on the financial statements or corrected. They both relate to issues that were identified in prior years and continue in the current year. The first relates to the superannuation fund, where the city is not accruing the cost of indexation of that plan, which is approximately estimated at $15.5 million, resulting in an understatement of the liability. And the second is related to a pre-existing plan provision of approximately $6.5 million, which should be an increase to the liability and should have been taken in a prior year, but is being amortized into the liability over the expected average remaining service life. The overall impact of these is primarily to accumulated surplus, $23.2 million, and a very minor impact to the annual surplus, resulting in an understatement. Other area of focus is tangible capital assets. As Isabel mentioned, these are a significant asset on the financial statements at $16 billion. So we do a fair amount of work around additions, disposals, amortization. We do an extensive data analytic program with all of the data from the city's financial statements related to the tangible capital assets. And we also review significant agreements. In this case, we focused on the Ottawa Light Rail Transit agreement and how the costs and related transfer payments and commitments were recorded in the financial statements. As a result of our work, we did identify a couple of differences in this area as well, both again related to prior years that are flowing through the statements in the current year. One related to an overstatement of the depreciation expense in the current year, resulting in an understatement of the annual surplus of $15.5 million. And the second related to an overstatement of the tangible capital asset balance of approximately $13.5 million, which is being amortized. It's a delayed amortization, so it is resulting in an understatement of the annual surplus by about $0.4 million. We focus also on commitments and the disclosure related to commitments. We look at the existence, completeness, and valuation of those commitments, specifically related to the note disclosure in the financial statements. And we focus on the net long-term debt, which is also a significant balance in the city's financial statements. We confirm the debt, the occurrence of the repayments. We verify the completeness of the principal and the related disclosure, as well as the interest expense. We did identify a difference that was also existed in the prior year financial statements, exists again in the current year, which is the netting of $225 million of long-term receivable with long-term debt. We would generally expect this to be shown gross, but the city has shown it net because the substance of the transaction is that these two, the receivable and the payable, mimic each other in their payment streams and are expected to be received and repaid on a essentially directly. As one comes in, the other goes out. The same is done with the interest income and expense related to that transaction, where it's been netted rather than being shown gross on the statement of operations. The difference doesn't have an impact on the net debt. I'll just correct that it does impact total financial liabilities. It does result in an understatement of total financial liabilities, but also an understatement of total financial assets. So the net impact is nil on the net debt and no impact on the annual surplus, and minimal impact on the city's debt service ratio. And the final area, I won't go into a lot of detail. There were a couple of other uncorrected differences that were identified, primarily related to payables that were recorded just in the wrong year, so essentially a cutoff issue, which results in an overall understatement of the annual surplus of approximately $4.4 million. All other differences were corrected by management. There were 5 new accounting standards implemented by the city this year, and we were comfortable. There were no significant impact as a result of those standards, and we were comfortable with the disclosure that the city provided on those. And I think that is it for my presentation. Happy to answer any questions on the audit.
Thank you very much, both, for your presentation. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. And I just have, one simple question. Can we get a copy of your report as well?
I believe it was posted.
It's been posted? Okay, thank you.
I believe so, yeah.
And you mentioned in there the an error that's been carrying over where we're not accounting for the accrual on the pension, the indexing of the pension. Can you say again how much that amount was?
It's estimated at 15.5 million, and it's related to the superannuation fund specifically.
Okay, and maybe for Ms. Jasmine, is there a reason we're not doing that?
So for this COSF fund, the fund itself funds 55% of the indexation. The city annually, we put in our budget the remaining 45% to bring it up to 100%. That's approved every year as part of the budget. At any point in time, council could decide not to supplement that amount, and so that's why we don't show it as a future commitment.
Okay. Okay, thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I can't help but wonder, when we just had an offer to get an audit done for our city books, and yet we clearly have audits done, and they've gone very well, and there doesn't seem to be any major infractions here, and the money seems to be well spent. The one thing that I noted was in terms of as people move on to retirement, the expense of long-term disabilities. And of course, if there's any major changes coming up due to pressures from provincially, we're going to have more of that. Is this something that's just sort of getting more out of control in terms of the costs of actually laying people off?
Are you responding to the future benefits and liability? Yeah, that is an amount that increases with each of the claims. So, for example, WSIB and LTD, for those claims, we add additional liability for future claims. There's an actuarial assumption and estimation done for those future claims. Every year, those claims are increasing, and that's what's reflected in those increases.
So it shows that, even though when we, if we're forced to trim down, we're going to have some major costs there in terms of paying out to people, which of course we have to do.
Each year we budget for the annual costs. So those are already built into the budget. These are future liabilities that would be estimated for the future. And in those years, when we know those amounts, we would actually budget for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just follow up on Councillor Kavanagh. So I asked the same question daily about the unfunded liability. Are we, in compared to other municipality of our size, are we have enough funding for that for the unfunded? Because one thing Councillor Kavanagh touched on, and I think it's not just in our municipality, it's across everywhere. There's more, you're paying sometimes more than, but you have a new stream coming to the labor force, so it's more people leaving. And so that unfunded liability itself is going to be creating pressure on us year after year because you have less people contribute to that. So can you just elaborate a little bit on it?
So we completed a full review of our reserves, and the unfunded benefits liability was one of them. MNP came in and looked at our using a risk management framework, looking at how much you want to put aside. You don't want to put aside 100% of that liability because it is just an estimate. You want to put away a reasonable amount. And so in those years when you are short in your budget, you could draw down on those reserves. And they recommended that we maintain, I believe it was around 12% of the overall liability as a reserve, and the remainder would be unfunded, and that was based on best practices. Okay, so
we still followed best practice with other. The other question is about the $22 million. You talk about the endowment from hydro investment. You said 22 million. But is that a set number, or I thought the number was anything over 20 million can go back to the operation because some of our colleagues put something to that perspective to be spent if it's over 20 million. But I mean, when you mention 22, is that a set number in your mind?
So it's actually, I rounded up, it's 21.9
Okay.
million, and that's what we would have received in 2018, reflecting 2017 operations. Anything over the 20 million, but in our financial statements, we report the full 21.9, and then, but anything over and above the 20 million, that's what we would use for. Yeah, and Marion can answer the rest.
So, Councillor, there's two things with hydro. One is the endowment fund, and that's where your 200 million reference is to. And we earn 6.5% on that fund, but that's not part of what that's just part of normal operations. What they're referring to is the actual dividend itself. And we budget every year 20 million for the dividend, and last year we received 21.9. So that's the reference. So there's actually two sources of funding coming in, from one directly from hydro and one from when we basically cashed in the debt several years ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor El Shantiri. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Could I direct my question at Ms. Jasmine? When you, at the beginning of your financial statement, you mentioned that we had additional payables for the Confederation line. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
That's just the 260 million that we're holding back because of the delay.
Okay. And that hasn't been paid out yet?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, and it picks up on Councillor Kavanagh's and Councillor El Shantiri's questions with respect to future liabilities and pension and health. I see on our report on page 26, page 29, I believe, healthcare inflation rate is currently at 2% and future 5.9%. Can you explain to us how this impacts our future liabilities? Either one of you.
These are amounts that are developed by our actuaries. Mercer conducts a review every 3 years and provides these estimates. There's 3 inflation estimates. There's one for overall inflation, which is at 2%. There's a salary increase estimate of 1.99 to 2.5. The 5.9 was actually graded down to 4%, and that's the one related to inflation rate related specifically to healthcare. So they have an inflation rate associated with the healthcare costs, and it was at 5.9. It's been brought actually down by 4%. So that would have reduced the liability.
How does this impact our future liabilities? Are these for past, is this relevant or relative to past employees for which we have to pay healthcare costs through insurance, or current employees? How will this have an impact, this level of inflation?
It's current employees and retirees.
And
Current.
retirees,
Yeah, and retirees.
Okay. And so it has a significant impact. It has a significant impact that would be budgeted for every year?
In the year, yes, it is budgeted for.
Okay. And just to confirm, the actuaries are independent. They are our internal, but you said, Madame Gignac, that E&Y also has actuaries that review our actuaries' work.
We do. The city engages actuaries to do the valuation, and then EY, as part of our audit process, has internal actuaries as well that review the city's actuaries' valuation, and in particular look at the assumptions and make sure they're reasonable and resulting in an appropriate liability on the financial statements.
Since the close of these financial statements, there was a significant accident. And we were served with a notice of lawsuit yesterday, and the provincial government, which is a funder of the City of Ottawa, has said that there would be cuts, and then they reversed. How do these events enter into your report with respect to subsequent events and future liabilities? Are you able to provide us assurance that that these are accounted for and reported on?
So the event happened after the year end, so it is a subsequent event. We look at whether it is determinable and whether an estimate can actually be made at this point in time. We wouldn't accrue in the 2017 financial statements because the event took place, in the 2018 financial statements because the event took place in 2019. But it is something that is caught up in your general disclosure related to your contingent legal liabilities. And I think right now, once there is an estimate and, claims have been served and there's an idea of what the amount will be, we will expect the city to accrue that, but I expect it will take place in the 2019 financial statements rather than the 2018.
Okay. Is it disclosed in the notes?
I don't believe it is currently disclosed. It's more caught up in the general disclosure with respect to the city has a number of outstanding claims, and where they're not determinable, they are not accrued in the financial statements at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh, please.
Thank you. I have a question in terms of the surplus. For most people out there, they look at the numbers and they see that in 2018 we have a higher annual surplus and wonder, why we didn't spend more money on programs, et cetera. One of the biggest factors that we saw in terms of what we expect we'll see more spending on is winter maintenance. It's a beautiful day outside today, but we all know how much work and how much effort it took this winter on winter maintenance. How does that fit in when we're looking at these figures in terms of the future?
Yeah, so there's a difference between what we budget and what we report in terms of our financial statements. Financial statements are reported on an accrual basis, and it includes non-cash items. I would give an example, contributed capital. Developers put in assets on behalf of the city. That's considered contributed capital. It shows as a number within our surplus, but it's not money that actually came over to the city that we have to spend. And so that's why we actually budget on a cash basis. And on cash basis, we reflected the $19 million surplus versus the 600.
Thank you. I'm used to school board where the surplus meant that our enrollment went up, and it's always hard to predict. And, it's one of those things that we don't know in advance, and we just have to budget as close as possible. So it's a little different here. But in terms of overall spending, it looks like that we could have spent a bit more, like on our programming, because that's a significant difference, almost 50% more from the year before. It was. I guess we had the 2% cap on in that time. So how did that affect the spending?
I just need some clarification. When you say 50% more, you're talking about the 462 million versus the 609? Again, those are mostly non-cash reflections. The surpluses were, on a cash basis, the surpluses were fairly consistent between 2017 and 2018. So it would have been additional contributed capital, changes in depreciation, and those non-cash items.
Okay, so in terms of assets that have gone up and
more
down.
more investment in assets.
Okay, thanks.
The budget is done on a cash basis, while the financial statements are done on an accrual basis. And thus, and in your report, there's a reconciliation of those, which perhaps we could talk about with any interested member of council, how that
Happy to
how that
go
impacts
through
our
the details
decision
with
making.
anyone. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, the report recommendation is that the Audit Committee recommend Council approve the draft 2018 City of Ottawa Consolidated Financial Statements. Is that carried? Carried. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your report and for your service. On to item, on to item number 3, the Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups. And while the Auditor General is taking his seat, I will ask the Vice Chair Meehan to introduce a motion, please.
Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General, Report on Audit Follow-ups and Detailed Audit Follow-up Reports was not circulated with the agenda package, therefore it be resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of this document for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89(3) of the Procedure Bylaw, and that is Bylaw number 2019-8.
Thank you, Vice Chair. That carried. Thank you. So the Auditor General is going to present a report on six audit follow-ups that he and his office have completed. And in discussion, we will stop at the end of each audit for questions by members of the committee. And that is because for continuity and efficiency, and because, as I've said before, we will be revolving into a closed session. And so I will leave that to the Auditor General, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour. Bonjour, les membres of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to members of the committee and to other councillors who have joined us here today. So, as I say every time when I come here, it isn't possible for the three people at this table to do this work. There is a team, some of whom are here today, joining us, and these are the people from our office. I'm joined at the table by the two Deputy Auditor Generals, Sonia Brennan and Ed Miner. Il y a deux vérificateurs généraux adjoints, M. Ed Miner et Madame Sonia Brennan. I'd also like at this time to, I know we'll be going in camera at the end, but I didn't want to go any further without thanking the efforts put into this work by the staff. The management and the staff provide time to us when we do the audits, and then of course they provide time to us again later when we do the follow-ups. So, Mr. Chair, I would like to reiterate the process that we go through in the field work. Whether we're doing an audit or whether we're doing a follow-up, we always kick off our project with a meeting with staff, and then we provide debriefings throughout the course of our work, and they can be any time. And once we've completed our work, we debrief the management of the area under audit or under follow-up, and we indicate our findings. We prepare a draft report. It's sent to a staff for fact review, and that can take 4 to 5 weeks, depending on the complexity of the area under review. And then we prepare a final report where we require management comments, and once again, that can take another 4 to 5 weeks. Now, that time period can change depending on activities within the area under review. There have been instances where, for example, an activity like the flood, we might provide additional time for an area to provide those comments if they're actively engaged in an important city activity. So, Mr. Chair, just to point out that the Office of the Auditor General is guided by two groups of standards. The Institute of Internal Auditors, we take their standards, we modify them a little bit, and they become the City of Ottawa audit standards. And when we look at the standards themselves, the standards from the Institute of Internal Auditors indicate that the Chief Audit Executive must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions have been effectively implemented in the area under audit. Selon l'Institut de vérificateurs internes, le chef de la vérification doit instituer un processus de suivi afin de surveiller et d'assurer que les mesures adoptées par la direction ont été mises en œuvre. And the timing of that follow-up is generally 2 to 3 years after the audit report has been determined. But as you'll see with one of the follow-ups that we're presenting today, we can modify that time, the time period where we go in to do that follow-up if certain actions have happened that might make it inconvenient for us to go in at that point in time because of what's going on within the organization. So the standards also indicate that the timing and scope of both audits and follow-ups are at the discretion of the Auditor General, but I can assure you that before we do any work, we absolutely make sure that we provide adequate notice before we go in, and we ensure that we're not going to, that we're going to minimize the effect on the operations of the area under review. So, Monsieur le Président, le processus de vérification comporte 4 phases. Et, les 4 phases sont la planification, le travail sur le terrain et l'établissement du rapport et finalement la phase de suivi. Et la raison aujourd'hui pour la réunion, c'est de discuter les suivis. There are 4 phases in our audit process. The planning phase, the field work phase where we actually go in and do the work. The reporting phase where we develop a draft report and a final report. And we present that to council in our annual report as we did last month. And then the follow-up phase. And of course, today we're presenting reports from that final phase. So we conduct follow-up reports on all audits. And as I indicated, we generally wait 2 to 3 years after an audit report is completed to provide ample time for the management to implement the recommendations. And the follow-up really closes the circle. You begin deciding which area you're going to audit by performing a risk assessment. We add those areas to our annual work plan. We come back to Audit Committee and we tell you these are the areas that we're proposing to audit. We perform our work. We present an audit report, and then management promises to council in that audit report that they're going to implement those recommendations within a certain time period. And then we do this follow-up to check on the promises that were made to council, and we report back to committee and council with the progress on that implementation. La raison de suivi de vérification permet le Bureau de vérificateur général de vérifier les progrès accomplis par la direction sur les projets de vérification. Today we present our overall evaluation of progress made to date across all completed audits. Should council wish to have a more detailed discussion of specific follow-ups, we'd be pleased to provide that later. Today, as was mentioned by yourself, Mr. Chair, we were presenting 6 follow-ups. The first is an audit of accounts payable. We'll actually be presented that second. We'll begin with the audit of the automated meter reading project, followed by the audit of winter operations. And then finally, you'll see 3 audits in the IT area. And members of the Audit Committee have heard me say before that when we go into an area where there is significant expertise required and we don't have that expertise in our office, we make arrangements with outside subject matter experts to help us perform the work in that area. So when we did those 3 audits in IT, we brought in outside experts to help us to perform that audit, and we indicated that to you when we provided the reports. And it's no surprise that that we brought in experts from KPMG to assist us in the follow-up to those audits to ensure that we had acknowledged experts looking at that area of expertise, looking at that subject area. The final item will be provided in camera. When we presented that audit a couple of years ago, that audit was presented in camera, and there was no reporting out. And other than indicating the progress on the recommendations so far in that audit, everything will be presented in camera. So, selon le travail que nous avons fait, c'est clair que la direction s'engage à respecter le procès de vérification. And I can confirm to Audit Committee that management continues to be committed to the audit process. And you'll see that there has been some progress on implementation of the recommendations in all of the reports that we're providing here. 56% des recommandations sont complétées et 37% des recommandations sont en cours. Mr. Chair, 56% of the recommendations from the 6 audit reports that we're presenting today are complete, and 37% of the recommendations are in process. Premièrement, la vérification de le projet de lecture automatisée des compteurs d'eau. La gestion a implémenté toutes les recommandations, donc pour nous, il n'y a pas beaucoup pour nous de dire selon cette vérification.
Morning, Chair. The first report that we're giving the results of our follow-up on is the audit we did of the automated meter reading project. That audit had 4 recommendations, and we found that all of them had been fully implemented. So we have no real further detailed comments, although we're willing to entertain any questions should there be any.
Did any committee member have a question on the meter reading follow-up audit? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. The original audit of accounts payable was an independent assessment of the control framework in place for the processing of city payables. In this audit, opportunities were identified. Opportunities were identified in the use of potential use for more automation with the technology already available to drive greater process efficiency and to maximize potential cost savings. We also identified areas where there were specific controls that we felt should be strengthened in this process. 7 recommendations were made in our report. In the follow-up, you will see that we concluded 2 are fully complete, 3 partially complete, 1 not started, and 1 no longer applicable. With respect to the 3 partially completed recommendations, the audit recommended that for a key control where enhanced system access is granted, so this is within the financial system SAP, there is ability for users to have what's called enhanced system. There's a risk with this type of access in the granting process, so there are specific controls around it where there's a check to make sure the conflict is within a sort of a risk tolerance and that it's appropriately approved. We had recommended that when this occurs, there's a procedure written and that it's documented that this has been done by the employee responsible. What we found in our testing is that the documentation wasn't consistently kept, so there was no way to assure whether or not the actual control would be carried out every time. Secondly, there was a recommendation that management establish a process to track and report on late penalties paid for payables. So these are situations where the city doesn't pay an invoice in a certain period of time, they would incur interest or penalty charges. While accounts payable did set up a designated expense account to track these penalties and interest, the responsibility is on the business user to identify the penalty on the invoice and to code that expense to that account. No evidence was provided as to how or when business users were notified about this account and the requirement for them to code late fees or interest charges. So in summary, there wasn't really assurance that the penalties were being recorded or tracked. And really the reasoning behind that was that, you know, if we're tracking those expenses, management can see that they're incurring charges that are unnecessary, and they can take actions to prevent that from occurring again. And third item that was partially complete, the original audit recommended that the city leverage existing technology to automate monitoring of potential discounts. So another potential for cost savings on invoice payments. The system enhancements, they were deferred and they'll be addressed with a new solution. So the existing solution where this was to take place is being replaced. And management's indicated that will occur sometime in 2020. So they've deferred that particular action and we'll look to address it in the, with the new solution. In terms of the item that we've assessed as not started, we'd recommended and management agreed that a control related to fraud risk, and this control is around the ability to change sensitive, what we call vendor master information. So within the financial system, there's a database of the vendor information, so vendor's name, address, and banking information. So the ability to change this information has to be carefully controlled with appropriate approvals. We had recommended that that they embed the control right in the system, so there's no bypass. It's right in the system, and the user or the administrator can't change the information without appropriate approval, and that approval involves seeing that there's adequate documentation for that. Changes were made to the process, but they weren't specifically the same as what we'd recommended, and in our opinion, they didn't address that area of risk. Management has indicated that, again, with the new solution, that they would address this particular item with that implementation. And finally, one new item came up when we were reviewing controls to prevent duplicate payments. So duplicate payments are what we call, as accountants call it, is when the city pays an invoice twice in error. So when we looked at two ways invoices can be paid, one is through purchasing cards, so it's essentially the same as you would pay a bill with a credit card. And a second is when the vendor emails the invoice to the accounts payable, and then the invoice is processed through a system called MarkView, and then the business owner would approve that invoice through that means. What we'd found that there was no way to prevent or detect a situation when an invoice from a vendor was paid with a P card, if that vendor also emailed the invoice directly to accounts payable, it could be processed again and paid without necessarily being noticed. This was a weakness in the control area that was already known by accounts payable. They'd indicated that they're looking on a way to resolve the issue and automate the information so that they could analyze and detect whether or not there were any duplicates paid through this method. We recommended that they notify purchasing card users of this risk. We're not sure that people knew that this was a possible risk. To let them know that they were responsible to put in a process to make sure that they prevented duplicate payments that could occur through this method. We have seen that notification has been done. So as you've heard, there are a number of actions incomplete, and some of which will be addressed by a solution replacing the existing technology in approximately a year's time. So I can answer any questions if you have any.
So on item number 2, accounts payable, Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on a couple points, including your last one on the duplicate payments. Did I understand you correctly that you're saying it's the responsibility of the card holder to make sure there's not duplicates, or the responsibility of accounts payable?
It's the responsibility of the card holder. So each business area has people responsible for the purchasing cards, and then they may have same or other people who are processing payments through the system. So if one doesn't see the other and an invoice is sent twice, or it could be paid 2 times.
I'm not following the logic to that, because the card holder wouldn't necessarily have access to whether invoices are coming into accounts payable to be paid for the same thing. Why wouldn't that responsibility reside in the system and with accounts payable?
It's up to management to look at what their existing processes are and find a way to make sure that that's prevented.
Well, do we agree that it doesn't make sense that the card holder does that? Like, Kevin Wiley's here. He's got people that have a credit card to go out and get, if they have to buy plywood to fix something. Why should they be responsible to make sure that the building supply company doesn't send an invoice in through finance? I'm not following that. Why wouldn't we make a recommendation that accounts payable takes responsibility for that?
It's within the business process. They've set up who has responsibility to pay invoices or control and monitor purchasing cards. So really the recommendation that we made isn't specific to who exactly carries it out, but each business unit that has that responsibility, and they all do, they need to look at what they're doing and make sure that between the different people who approve payments, that they have something in place that will detect these things. We didn't specify that it was the purchasing card holders, because it may not make sense that those are the individuals, that are monitoring and responsible for it by themselves. No.
Chair, is it okay if staff weigh in?
And Mr. McDonald, our Chief Procurement Officer, I believe?
That's correct. Mr. Chair, it's the responsibility of the person making the purchase, whether they're paying with a purchasing card or approving an invoice, to make sure that they are only approving that invoice once and that the invoice is correct and they've received the goods and they are to the satisfaction of the city. And so whether that's being received by an invoice through accounts payable, that would then be workflowed to the user, or with the purchasing card directly, it's that individual that's responsible for ensuring the correctness of the payment.
So if it comes in, let's use that scenario I drew then, and I hope Kevin doesn't mind. We'll use him as an example. If he makes a purchase on the card, he's obviously responsible to make sure that the proper documentation of that purchase with the card is submitted for approval. But if they send an invoice, they being, let's say Cashway, because they're out of business, okay? Cashway sends an invoice to the City of Ottawa. It goes in through finance for the same product, some mix-up on their end. Kevin can't be responsible for verifying that invoice.
So in that scenario, that invoice that's received by accounts payable would then be forwarded to Kevin in this example for approval.
Okay, so then there is a process for duplicates.
That's right, and as a result of the recommendation, the system has been improved to allow the duplicate analysis to be made between P-card payments and MarkView payments, which was a gap previously.
Okay. The other piece in the audit that concerned me, well, two more pieces. One is on page 4 about the late fees, that nothing was put in place to capture the late fees. Why is that? It's missed opportunity, right?
So, Mr. Chair, the account to capture the late fees was created. The finding was around the communication around how that information is coded in the system. That communication has been updated as part of the contract administration policy and associated training that was developed in response to the audit of road services, where we go through the responsibilities of invoice receipt and approval and the associated components.
But the audit says that it wasn't communicated, so it has been just recently?
That's right. This is in response to the audit of road services recommendations,
Okay.
which was last year.
So is that going to be done on an annual basis, or what's the plan forward to make sure that people know to use that coding?
That's right. This is ongoing training that's going to be provided regularly. We are providing this training across the corporation. In addition, as a result of changes made to the Construction Act, which are implementing a prompt payment regime and associated penalties, we are working with our high-volume invoice approvers to ensure that they have a process to pay their invoices in accordance with the legislation and not incur late fees.
So I take it audit is happy with the progress being made, or did you want to comment on that?
Mr. Chair, if all of our work is as of the time we prepare reports at the time that we've done our work. This has obviously happened subsequent to our completion of the audit work and the report. And if that communication has happened, then it would seem that it has likely addressed that issue.
Would you not be sending a copy to the AG's office as part of all the recommendations and that are made? Wouldn't a copy of that communication go to the AG so that they would have it on file that it's been done and how it's broken out? Like, for example, that it's going to be repeated?
Mr. Chair, we finished this follow-up in the fall. So when did this communication last happen?
So the contract administration policy was finalized in December of last year, and the training is being implemented throughout this year, beginning with road services and then across the corporation.
So not everybody's had it yet then?
Not everyone has received the training yet, but the policy is in place, which governs all contracts.
So okay. Not everybody's trained yet. What's the timeline to get everybody trained? And on important issues such as this late fees, would it not make sense to send some sort of a memo out as well so that they know, the ones that are using it? I think you said the high volume users are being trained first, or no?
That is correct.
Okay.
In accordance with the Construction Act changes. So what I would say is that as part of the contract administration policy update, communication was sent out across the corporation, including through management updates, to make sure that those people that are responsible for administering contracts understand their roles and responsibilities. In addition, we have another layer of training, which goes through not only invoice approval processes, but also dealing with supplier performance and general contract administration, which we are rolling out as an enhanced level of training over and above the policy. So the communication has been forwarded across the corporation.
Okay, thank you. So my last question then is on the, I believe, 2 of the 6 recommendations. At the time of your follow-up, Mr. Auditor General, I believe 2 of the 6 recommendations were done. And when I read the report, it says they're following up on the other 4. But isn't that typically the response at the original audit? I'm a little concerned that that's what you're getting at the follow-up stage. Because shouldn't everything basically be implemented by the time you do the follow-up? Isn't that the expectation?
Mr. Chair, when we decide to do our follow-ups, we look at the management comments from the original audit where they indicated when they would be implementing the solutions to the recommendations. And that's why we give 2 to 3 years generally before we go in to do that work. This audit was presented in 2015, and we did our work in the late summer and fall of 2018. And this was what we found, that some of the items hadn't been completed.
Thank you. So would you also agree that it seems disappointing that we're still waiting for 4 of the recommendations? I think based on what you're telling me, you're making progress on them. Is your expectation to get this wrapped up this year?
So, Mr. Chair, following the audit, there were 2 unexpected changes in the technology marketplace, both in how SAP administers its payment modules and in notice to the city that the MarkView system would be discontinued effective the end of this year. And so we determined it would not be in the city's best interest to invest in configuration changes to software we know need to be replaced. So we have taken the recommendations and made these key business requirements of the new source-to-pay solution, which is to be implemented in Q1 of 2020. We're currently developing, designing, and configuring the tool this year for go live in Q1.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. Councillor DeRuse, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just follow up. I know that some of the questions they were answered, but are you saying?
He said first.
Sorry, are you saying that you're not, based on the recommendation, you have 3 partially, you're 43% working on them, and then there is a recommendation, as I understood, that it's going to be pushed to 2020. And that's because what? Because the software is, you're not going to spend, you're not going to put resources to reconfigure what we have right now. Are we implementing something new in 2020?
That's correct. The software is being replaced currently. It will go live in Q1 of 2020. And so both the SAP configuration changes and the MarkView configuration changes, we recommended not completing those because that software is being replaced this year.
But between now and then, are we still making sure that we're double checking on the double payment and making sure that our bills being paid? Because I also want to, that lead for my next question will be, are we comparing year after year, because this audit done in 2015, I know we had follow-up in 2018, but are we making sure that the numbers are decreasing, not increasing, by making sure we're not double paying the payment and adding some other process to make sure to cross our eyes and making sure we're not doubling and paying overpayment for the unpaid bills?
That's correct. And so the recommendations were around improvements in automation in the tool. The manual processes continue to exist, and we have made improvements in those manual processes, and the automation will be implemented as part of the new source-to-pay solution in Q1.
Thank you. My question will be then, so the partially not completed 3 of the items, they'll be done, all of them by 2020, or just one of them?
All of them.
And my question is, how come we have one is not started yet? Just, can you shed some light on that one? There's
this-
one recommendation, it's not started.
Yes. So this recommendation had to do with the automation of the vendor master maintenance controls. How vendor master information is maintained in the new solution may be different than how it is currently maintained in core SAP. And so as a result, this is also a recommendation that will be addressed as part of the new tool.
In the new software
That's
and the new
correct.
tools that we're going to install. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Santiri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you can just put it in some perspective for me, when you talk about double payment, how many times that happened? Can you put a dollar figure, how many times the city did the double payment in this matter? Do we have those numbers?
Mr. Chair, I have to put my finger on the number in the report. I believe it's a small amount. This isn't a significant material cost problem. I think it was $29,000 in the report. That was over, thank you. That was over a period of 1 year. Duplicate payments are not uncommon, but certainly we want to ensure, as does accounts payable, that the city prevents them is the better approach, because there's cost and time and effort after the fact, once you've done it, to then recover that cost and investigate those payments. It's always better to have good controls in place at the front end to prevent them from happening. But there's also a duplicate payment check analysis that's done, I believe, once or twice a year. And our original audit recommended that they formalize that in a procedure. It was done more on an ad hoc basis, and we recommended that it be formalized in a procedure to ensure that over time, as staff changes or systems change, that control is maintained.
Well, it's a good measure, and obviously it doesn't matter what the amount is still city taxpayers' money we need to protect. But at the same time, it's good sometimes to put it in a perspective, because obviously the city do a lot of payment out. So in a real life, that's a very, very small percentage if we're going to put it in a percentage perspective. Now, because what we hear is the other way around. People complain how the city quickly to charge them delay payment or something to them. So I'd like to know how much you collect from the other side of this, like in overpayment from resident or delay payment, I should say. When people are delaying payment, how much we collect a year?
So, Mr. Chair, the city has a prompt payment opportunity as well. In 2015, the city's achievement rate was 45%, and we received around 480,000. Since that time, we've taken an opportunity to apply a more strategic perspective to how we monitor prompt payment opportunities, having increased that achievement rate to over 90% and $1.2 million.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Santiri. Vice Chair Meehan, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. One of them relates to, I'm not sure I noticed anywhere in any of the reports how many invoices are issued each year, but I can well imagine they're in the thousands, right? In the initial audit, I noticed it cost us it's over $8 to issue an invoice, and that's indicated as one of the second highest costs in the province. And I'm just wondering, who do we compare to, and why is it so expensive to issue an invoice?
So, Mr. Chair, to answer your first question, the city processes around 300,000 invoices a year. If I understand correctly, the cost is with a payment by check, not the receipt of the invoice. We've actually gone through a process to eliminate check payments for trade payable vendors, and this was completed at the end of 2017.
But, I mean, to issue the invoice, that's different than receiving payment.
So the invoice is issued by the supplier and received by the city.
And so do we know how much this would cost us?
There isn't a cost to receiving an invoice on the part of the city. It's issuing the check payment, if I understand correctly, is what creates the cost to the city.
And who were we comparing this to?
The cost of a check, it's more of an industry baseline on the costs that go into the printing and administration of check payments.
So, okay. Are we looking at any way to bring that cost down?
So yes, we have eliminated check payments for trade payable vendors. We've moved those to electronic funds transfer, and so this was completed at the end of 2017.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question relates to recommendation 1 on the audit, and the city was to formalize the requirement to retain documentation, and we find that the Auditor General has determined that documentation is not always retained, and documentation we need in order to track everything. We need the documents. So if the documents are not being retained as per the recommendation of the city audit, of the Auditor General, and management has responded that they need this and they accept this recommendation, when staff do not retain the documentation, what's the repercussion of that? And are we doing anything to change that? I mean, does anybody discipline staff who don't keep documents?
So this was related to a specific process where when we were assigning a delegation of duties or assigning roles and responsibilities to an individual or a user to make sure that there's segregation of duties. And there's a report that gets printed by SAP to see if there's any conflicts. And that's the report that was not retained. So they went through the entire process, got approvals from the supervisor that they had authority for those roles and responsibilities, but the documentation, which was the SAP report, and that was just 2 incidents, I believe, that were identified that hadn't retained the SAP report. So it's just a very, very specific process. And then now that has now been changed so that we do retain that SAP report for all requests.
And is that satisfactory to the Auditor General and his team?
When we find that a process that has been put in place to solve a particular issue, if it isn't being followed and we bring it to their attention and management corrects their process to make sure that they're corrects their practices so that they follow policy and procedures, then we're satisfied with that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Councillor Kavanaugh, please.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that this has been done. I see this as sort of the nuts and bolts of what we do. Accounts payable. It's it's our everyday business, and for most people it'd be kind of boring, but it's really important. And I'm glad that it's being looked at. My question is in regards to how we compare with other municipalities. Is this something that's an issue for other municipalities? Are others doing better? Also, in terms of software, is everyone using the same thing, or because software keeps changing, that's probably part of the problem sometimes when you keep updating systems. So just wanted your comments in terms of our comparisons with other municipalities.
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, there's a practice that exists in the province called the Ontario Municipal Benchmarking Index, and the participating municipalities submit data which allows them to compare their costs or their activities, their efficiency against other municipalities. And the City of Ottawa participated in that project for a number of years, and it's my understanding that that we no longer participate in some areas. Is that correct? Yeah.
Is there a reason why we don't participate? We don't want to be compared?
That would have to be directed to management, Mr. Chair.
Councillor, we had a discussion or a decision to be made when we did the reorganization because we were reducing the amount of management within the city back in 2016. We had to reduce the amount of work that was also there, and as we had not actually saw any tangible benefits from participating in there, we took a pause on it. The amount of effort to compile the data and submit it year after year after year was significant, and so we came forward to council and said, these are the things we're going to stop doing for a while until we get ourselves organized. So that's the reason why we no longer participate in OMBI.
How many other municipalities participate in it? Is it significant that we've dropped out of this? Are you aware?
It was most of the municipalities in Ontario. Unfortunately, when you're the second largest city, you don't really compare with almost everybody other than Toronto, which is 4 times our size. And then your next is basically Hamilton, which is half our size. So it becomes problematic to compare yourself just given your size. But it was an initiative that at least a significant portion of municipalities in Ontario participated in.
Okay, but so are we aware if we're using the same types of software? I mean, we must talk to other municipalities and just in terms of comparison there.
So, Mr. Chair, software changes are being made across the country. There are a number of municipalities, including Toronto and Edmonton, that have selected the same source-to-pay solution that the City of Ottawa is implementing, along with the federal government.
Okay, thank you. I agree that, you know, comparing ourselves in Ontario is not very effective. It'd be more useful to compare ourselves nationally, because there are other cities that are of comparison to us, and you know, not trying to create a competition between municipalities, but it's good to know what other people do, because, you know, this is everyday stuff. And, you know, why reinvent the wheel if others have found ways to prevent some of the concerns we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh and colleagues. Just a couple of questions, Mr. MacDonald. With respect to the sensitive vendor field, just want to point out first a comment and then 2 questions. The recommendation by the Auditor General was made in 2015, and here we are in 2019, and we are looking to change to the source to pay in 2020, but nothing has been done in that period with respect to that sensitive field. For example, banking information can be changed without appropriate review to change from a vendor's banking information for direct payment to another unauthorized place, receiver of that money, and that is a significant risk. So my disappointment that in 4 years, apparently nothing has been done on that. You just mentioned that other municipalities and the federal government are implementing source to pay, and that's new information. I hadn't seen that in the documentation. My question was, how have we made sure that source to pay is going, is it a module of SAP? Is source to pay a module of SAP, or is it separate?
So, Mr. Chair, the source-to-pay solution that the city has selected is a module of SAP.
Okay.
And it's with the elimination of MarkView,
Yes.
It's provided an opportunity for the city to look at how to integrate, streamline, and automate a number of the tasks that are being completed by finance, procurement, and accounts payable, which are currently managed in fragmented and siloed systems. And so there really is an opportunity to improve the process and automation. However, it is an unexpected and a much larger initiative than what was anticipated at the time of the audit.
I appreciate that. So my question is, how have you made sure that it is going to meet, and you've referred to several needs, how have you made sure that it is going to meet those needs? What process did your department go through to evaluate the system that it was the right solution?
So in selecting the solution, we did go through a detailed business case analysis and market assessment to ensure that the solution we would ultimately select would meet our business requirements. We've also engaged a system integrator, which is currently taking those business requirements, including the audit recommendations, and designing the solution to be configured for the city, which is underway right now.
Was a formal risk assessment undertaken with our friends in ITS with respect to this?
Yes, ITS is a partner with us in this implementation.
And so there's documentation with respect to the risks and the benefits of the source-to-pay solution?
That's correct, and it forms part of the business case.
Okay. My second question is, you spoke about training with respect to questions around penalties and late payments, and that's important to track and to reduce and to correct errors. And you spoke about training, but how have you addressed the issues of ensuring, while employees have been trained, what process is in place to ensure that the procedures are being followed and that the training has been implemented, actual on-the-line implementation?
So, Mr. Chair, the contract administration is a departmental responsibility, is the person managing the contract that's responsible to ensure that they are adhering to the policy. That being said, we are continuing to partner with the groups, the various operational departments in terms of training, as well as with the implementation of our vendor performance management program. There are a number of reviews that Supply Services is undertaking to make sure that the key activities associated with managing vendor performance are being undertaken, such as a completion of expectations, a final evaluation, and a review of any non-performing contractors to ensure that there isn't any larger issues that need to be addressed.
You're saying that the coding is done at the departmental level,
That's correct.
but the payment release is done at your department?
That's correct, following approval of the invoice by the end user.
And is there any subsequent review following departmental coding to ensure that if there are any indications of late payment or penalties that we want to reduce have been correctly coded? Is there any audit within your department to make sure that the departments whose information you are depending on have in fact done the work correctly to your satisfaction?
Mr. Chair, accounts payable would not be in a position to identify that the invoice is correct. It needs to be the person that is receiving the goods and services to validate that they have received the goods and services and that it is in accordance with the contract and that the rates are correct. Accounts payable is responsible for administering the payment process following that approval.
And that payment process is separate, there's the original PO or order of goods and services, but the issue that we're dealing with is because of a system breakdown or an error which happens, that there is additional costs incurred by the city, by the taxpayers of our city, and that is what we want to reduce. And so I'd like to know, perhaps we could take it offline, know a little bit more about how we can ensure that the procedures are being followed and that your department is not just grinding through an invoice, because you're the gatekeeper. You're the final gatekeeper of that.
I would be pleased to discuss that with you.
Okay. Thank you. And this is on the audit of accounts payable, and thus I think any other comments, Mr. Auditor General?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And now, if you could continue with your presentation, Winter Ops.
Le prochain suivi, c'est le suivi de la vérification des opérations hivernales. Et 17 des 20 rénovations ont été mises en œuvre et 3 sont en cours.
Mr. Chair, the next audit we followed up was the 2014 audit of winter operations, capacity planning and performance measurement. We found 17 of the 20 audits had been fully implemented, and 3 had been partially implemented. One of the recommendations that was partially implemented related to the mix of internal versus external resources that are used in winter operations. As you recall, the city had KPMG conduct a winter operations review in 2016. And in that review, KPMG assessed some of the costs and benefits and efficiencies of outsourcing. Management is now in the process of assessing the staff levels and the equipment at their various city yards. And their plan is to shift staff and equipment between the yards as they require balancing to make sure it's based on their workload. Management wants to get this done first, and then they're going to consider adjusting the mix of internal and external resources. As such, both management and the OAG assess this recommendation as being partially complete. The other 2 partially implemented recommendations both relate to performance reporting. The recommendations were to enhance monthly financial reporting by providing information and commentary on key cost drivers, and to improve reporting on key performance indicators that go beyond financial information. We found that management had reviewed the feasibility of enhancing the KPI reporting, and they expected to produce a revised road services dashboard at the end of this month in June of 2019. As we conducted our work in January of this year, both management and the OAG assessed this recommendation as being partially complete. I would now ask if there's any questions related to this report.
Thank you very much. Councillor Kavanagh, please.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important that we look at this, especially going forward when we're looking at updating our whole operations for winter maintenance. So I really appreciate this report. One of the concerns I really appreciate actually recommendation number 2 about regards to climate change, because that's probably the key thing that is in terms of what we're looking at going forward, in terms of what we find as an issue. We had like a horrendous winter. I don't know what else I can call it, and it was tough to adapt. So I appreciate that that this was looked at, and I just wanted to get your opinion on terms of what is needed in terms of the flexibility that is needed, because it means buying a lot more equipment, and you've talked about sort of the the need to the balancing act between what we own and what we get in terms of extra. I really appreciate the fact that we have a very large service, and most of it is what we operate ourselves rather than contracting out. We've got a good stable workforce, and that's really important. But I just wanted to get your opinions as auditors of the next steps in terms of coming towards this new process that we're going to be looking at.
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, a prudent manager is regularly looking at the risks that they face in the area under their authority, and in the same way that we look at the risks in an area when we go in to look at what areas we're going to focus on in an audit, we would expect the prudent manager would be doing the same thing. And when there are changes, a prudent manager would incorporate changes into their activities to address those, and I think that's a question probably best put to management specifically.
Yes, we will be talking to them
Did
for sure.
Mr. Wiley want to attend us?
Mr. Chair, I'll make a few remarks and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Levesque. We have 2 initiatives underway right now. As you may be aware, Councillor Chair Blais directed the department to do a service delivery review before this coming winter, and that's underway right now. And then we will be gearing up for our maintenance quality standard review that Councillor Kavanagh has just mentioned.
Just to build on what Mr. Wiley had conveyed, Mr. Chair, as part of that service delivery review, we'll be assessing our resources, equipment, contracted services, and beats to ensure that we have a consistent service delivery and deployment model going forward. So that'll be a big part of what we're doing this year in looking at how we deploy as far as managing these different weather events that we experience.
Okay, thank you. I think my other questions will probably be outside the audit process, because I'm certainly interested in what we're planning for the future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Probably you answered my question, but I'm looking at the recommendation, and I know this audit is follow-up from 2014. We have 20 of them. We have 20 recommendation. 17 completed. The partially completed, the 3 partially not completed, do you have a timeline for those? And how those are going to be impacted by the service review that we, Transportation Committee, we ask you to come back for us with a review by the end of 2019 for our service delivery model?
So just to address the recommendation, Mr. Chair, with regards to the KPIs, and performance measures. We've spent a lot of time putting together new business processes, as well as reporting mechanisms to collect the data with regards to our winter operations, in addition to investing in technology such as GPS so that we can track our performance with regards to our operation. So we have spent quite a bit of time putting those things in place so that this winter going forward, the final step will be to put the dashboard in place that we have all the data readily available that meets the recommendations that we agreed to with the Auditor General. The other component was around the optimal mix of internal and external resources. Really, that's been something that we've had in place within each area throughout the city as far as assessing that at an area level. Right now, as I had mentioned previously, we're looking at bringing together a consistent process where we look at all of our resources, equipment, and beats, and making sure that we have a consistent deployment model and service delivery model. And as you mentioned, that's something that will be finalized by the end of this year in 2019.
So those are for the three components, those are for the three recommendations that we still have. They should be implemented and done by the end of this year?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
And there will be any impact on the service review that we ask you to do, to go ahead and do it, and as Chair Blais asked?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is it going to be impact your review that we are asking you to do for the end of this year?
Yeah, currently that's underway right now.
But those changes, if we've done them in the last, if we follow the recommendation since the audit has been starting in 2014, will we have better winter and better winter maintenance in 18 and 17? I'm just wondering because it's taken us so long to implement those recommendations, but again, winter is not giving us any mercy, and I know that we have challenge with weather and snow, and I know that consistently across the city we don't have consistent beats. I'm just wondering why the delay and why we're still not implementing those, because if these things needed for our operation to improve the safety on our road and to making sure our technology is implemented, why it's taking us that long? This is started in 2014.
I think as Mr. Levesque pointed out, there was quite a bit of work in technology upgrades, installing all that in the equipment and other business processes that have all accumulated to this year. And it won't, to answer your first question, it won't impact our service delivery review that's underway. That won't be impacted. In fact, I think the things we're putting in place for this winter will actually enhance the service delivery review because we'll have full visibility of the operation through our dashboard.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get to. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that, because I want to make sure that we are not starting something new at the end of the year and then we're going to go back from square one to say, okay, we should have followed this recommendation, because we need to be ahead, not behind. That's my point.
Yes, so as I said, the intention and we're fully on track to be set up properly for this winter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question is actually a good follow-up, I think, to all my colleagues' questions. The first one is specifically, when we're talking about quality of standards and trying to implement better service delivery, going back to 2014, recommendation number 4 was that we assess the costs, benefits, and efficiencies of outsourcing and establishing an optimal mix of internal and external sources. That would have given us, if we had done this back in 2014, this would have given us some valuable information as we're moving forward. But number 4, it was, we haven't still done this. So I'm just wondering, when will we be able to say that this item is complete? This is the item, in-depth review and analysis of activities of our winter operations. We haven't completed this.
So it is partially complete, and through our work with the Auditor General, Mr. Chair, we did say this is an ongoing process and something that is a part of our operation. So when we look at contracts when they expire, that's the time that we take that business case approach and do that cost-benefit analysis as to, okay, how do we move forward? Is it with internal resources, or do we look at a contracted services for that activity? So it's something that I know when we work with the Auditor General, that we explain to them that really it's an ongoing process, and it's something that should be a part of the operation on an annual basis as contracts expire. Then we do that analysis and look at the cost benefits of internal resources versus contracted services.
Are you saying, when you say an ongoing process, does that mean it's never complete? We're never going to see an increase in standards that will help residents who are complaining and need better road maintenance and snow clearing in the winter?
Mr. Chair, I think there's two things that the councillor is speaking to. To just build on what Mr. Levesque said regarding taking a look at contracts as they come up, we did just have a large contract maintenance of the 174 that came up. We did a complete business case on it, and it was determined that it was better to be contracted out, so that was retendered. The standards review will be coming up in the future, and that's where we'll have a closer look at our maintenance quality standards, and if there are improvements or adjustments to be made on maintenance quality standards. The work we're doing this winter, although we're not changing the standards, we're still going to be working towards our council-approved standards. We are doing, as Mr. Levesque pointed out, many things, including resource balancing, consistency of approach, consistency of material, and that will all lead to a better, I think you'll see a better result this winter.
Okay, thank you. On recommendation 10, in 2014, it was recommended through the Auditor General that there would be enhanced monthly financial reporting, giving commentary on the performance-associated cost drivers. This would be like monthly lane, kilometer costs, impact to monthly precipitation, all the things that we're apparently measuring right now because it impacts service delivery. Management at that time agreed with this recommendation. It was passed by City Council. Yet there was a corporate alignment in 2016 and basically abandoned what this was going to do. Why would you have the authority to do that if council has already directed you to do this?
So we continued to look at those business processes and reporting mechanisms in order to collect all the data that was recommended through the Auditor General with regards to key performance measures and indicators within our operation. So that's something, even though the audit happened in 2014, as I had mentioned previously, there was quite a bit of work that needed to be done to get the business processes in place, to get the system mechanisms and reporting mechanisms in place so that we could obtain that data in order to pull it together in a dashboard format that's centralized and house all the information that we can view it kind of more broadly and in a dashboard type format.
Well, you know, it says, the management update, that after realignment was determined that the enhanced scorecard was too cumbersome. I mean, are you working on this or not?
So, Mr. Chair, we did have a scorecard in 2016 that was in place. However, as a result of this audit, we definitely needed to make some changes with regards to the type of data that we were inserting in the scorecard. So, as I had mentioned, that did take some time to put together those business processes.
So how long is this going to take? This was 2014.
Yeah, it will be completed as per our last follow-up and comments with the Auditor General. It should be completed by Q2 of this year. So like I had mentioned, we're just pulling together those final pieces to make the dashboard.
So, okay. And I just had one question about the salt truck deliveries. I know that you've notified or told staff not to tell the salt trucks that they're going to be measured, and I guess we've been told that staff are not doing that. How do we know that staff aren't notifying them? Is there some way to verify whether or not the salt truck just comes in without knowing when it's going to be measured?
So, Mr. Chair, those expectations are obviously clearly instructed to staff at the beginning of every year, in addition to what our standard operating procedures are for actually receiving salt. And in the case where we do weighing of the salt trucks, that's outlined in kind of the expectations and the orientation we do with staff at the beginning of the winter season, obviously referencing the standard operating procedures that we had put in place.
But is there a way to verify that they're not notifying the drivers?
If we do hear of that and that issue is brought to our attention, we do manage that.
If you do hear that they are telling the drivers that they're going to be weighed, that's just other staff reporting?
I think there's a miscommunication within kind of our audit with the Auditor General. I know that point was raised, but then we had come back and we said that wasn't an issue within our operation where we actually had staff notifying the truck drivers that we were going to be weighing that day. We did do clarification. We did follow up once that was brought to our attention, and I believe when you read through the audit, you can see that that wasn't actually happening within the operation. However, we did take it seriously and said that we do need to have expectations clearly laid out for staff, and we do need a standard operating procedure, which we had put together.
And that's just communicated verbally to staff?
No, Chair. All operating standard procedures are given to staff, and they're trained on them. And I will add that, I don't know if the Auditor General wants to elaborate, the whole process of weighing salt trucks coming in was audited by the Auditor General staff, and I think they were fairly satisfied.
Yeah, I would add we tested a couple of salt truck weighings. I mean, to the extent we could certainly tell the drivers of the salt trucks didn't know they were going to be weighed.
Okay.
They were. It's a bit of a timely process, and they really weren't too thrilled about it, but nonetheless they complied.
Okay. Okay. I thank you for that.
Thank you. And if there's no other questions, Councillor Kavanagh has to go back on.
Thanks. Just wanted to talk about parked cars because it's mentioned a few times in the recommendations, and it's one of those ongoing things with people scrambling to get their cars off the road. But I wanted to know how much of a cost does that put on our system when those cars are in the way? Does that really slow, because it's mentioned a couple of times in the recommendations, is this a really big problem in terms of costs?
Chair, it's hard to quantify. It is definitely an impediment to our plowing operations. In order to rectify it, we've been working with our bylaw partners, but we've also implemented, as you're probably aware, one-sided parking for problematic areas, and that's something that we've started a couple of years back, and we're continuing to improve, to expand upon as we go forward.
Thank you. I know it's with the amount of snow we got this winter, the problem is where to put the snow, and so every time there's things in the way, these are major problems. I just wanted to know in terms of cost saving, because it's asking for efficiencies, how do you see this possible with winters like we had this past year? How in terms of finding any kind of efficiencies?
Chair, our continuous improvement process is always looking for cost savings and efficiencies and better ways of doing things, but I will say that in a winter like we had, it's pretty tough to contain costs because really this winter it was all hands on deck.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions, comments on this. Further to the dashboard, Q2 2019, will that go to Transportation Committee? The dashboard that will be produced as a result of Recommendation 10 that was brought forth by Vice Chair Meehan?
Mr. Chair, the intent of the dashboard was to use that to inform conversations with councillors with regards to service delivery within their ward, as well as to discuss any issues that they may be experiencing on a year-to-year basis with regards to our winter operations.
Okay, so that doesn't need to be approved by Transportation Committee or get comment? You will roll that out and provide information to councillors so that we could share with our constituents?
Correct, Mr. Chair. That would be something that we would meet with you and have that discussion with regards to the information within it.
And just one more, with respect to, again, Vice Chair Meehan, about recommendation 17 and the salt trucks. I'll just bring to your attention that the recommendation was that winter operations ensure that all operation technicians do not notify delivery trucks in advance that they will be weighed. And I recognize you said that you didn't observe that, but you did agree with the recommendations. So again, while it's been incorporated in the training, I would like the department to further ensure that there is no, that delivery trucks are not advised that they will be weighed, and it's on a random basis, so that we ensure that the taxpayers of our city get the products and services that we are paying for.
We'll take that direction.
Basic,
Chair.
Good operations. And thank you very much, and thank you for your service last winter, Mr. Wiley. It's been difficult, and winter's ongoing. Thank you. Mr. Auditor General, we are at item number Audit of IT Governance.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux rappeler les membres du comité pour les dernières 3 suivis. Nous avons travaillé avec un expert dans le monde de technologie et information. Sur le suivi de la gouvernance des TI, 4 sur 9 recommandations sont complétées, mais il reste toujours des certain nombre de secteurs essentiels.
Thank you. IT governance is a formal framework. It provides structure to organizations to ensure that the IT investments that are made and the operations support the business's objectives. Essentially, it ensures that the organization is aligning its IT strategy and operations with the organization's strategy and objectives, and it's an integral part of the overall governance of the city operations. So as you've heard in many times and know, technology touches almost every operation of the city. In the original audit, we examined how the existing practices at the city compared to leading practices and standards. There were findings identified in each of the 5 areas you can see on the slide in terms of IT governance. Committees were operating. They were lacking, though, some key elements to help ensure that they maintain and support effective practices. Measurable objectives were lacking among managers and the CIO's annual performance evaluations, such as successfully implementing projects on time or within budget. We also found at the time of the audit that the extent of turnover at the CIO position had been substantial for a number of years, affecting the important leadership that is fundamental to good IT governance. We also found that there was a lack of established performance indicators that were related to the delivery of ITS's strategic value, as well as the lack of guidance within the ITS risk management policy as to how higher priority IT risks should be communicated upwards. With respect to our follow-up work, as Mr. Hughes had mentioned, 4 of the original recommendations were considered or assessed as complete, and 5 were considered partially completed. So some good progress had been made, and a number of key activities had been completed, although there were still a number of areas, important areas, that require further remediation. ITS has established visible linkages between IT services and the city's broad objectives, both through a new intake process as well as the ITS strategic work plan covering the period from 2018 to 2020. We found that although the ITS scorecard had been discontinued, it was replaced with a different mechanism called the client dashboard. The dashboard at the time of our work was still in a pilot phase and still needs to be fully implemented. In considering the area around performance measurement, objectives and key results metrics, and I'll refer to these as OKRs, these were introduced in the ITS strategic work plan, where each branch is responsible for developing key results that align to the ITS objectives and that directly support the strategic directive of the corporation. However, we found that a number of high-risk findings that were identified among the 3 IT audits that we're following up on, and these date back to 2015, were not fully completed, or in some cases not started. Some of these aspects we'll discuss in the closed session with respect to the audit of IT security, but we would have anticipated that these recommendations and the actions to remediate the risks that were identified would have been in the objectives and results monitored to completion by the department. It was also recommended in the original audit that objectives for the CIO be measurable. The CIO had completed his last performance evaluation, and performance objectives were outlined by the OKRs that were just mentioned. However, again, some of the risks and the actions that were in the original audit report were not included, and thus, as we see, not completed. Although the CIO has focused on many key strategic points to further the city's IT organization, it is important that high-risk items requiring remediation be a continued focus. In our original audit, we outlined that the extent of turnover at the CIO position has been substantial. This has continued. Since 2012, June, there have been another 7 individuals either in a full-time or acting role in this position. The original audit recommended that the recruitment of an experienced and appropriately qualified CIO be expedited. At that time, there was, I believe, a temporary CIO in the position, and that had followed a period of turnover. We noted that the most recent full-time CIO was appointed in July 2016. There was no internal or external search that held for the fulfillment of this position. The selection of an appropriate candidate for the critical CIO position is one that should not be made lightly, and we felt that it did not align with our recommendation. We recommended also that management develop an effective CIO succession plan. At the time of our audit follow-up, a formal documented succession plan did not exist for the city's CIO position. That's all, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think we really have to overstate the importance of information technology in our world today. We had an incident not that long ago, and we're hearing continually about breaches in government and companies that is costing everybody a lot of money. I am concerned about the number of CIOs that we've had over the past several years, and I'm just wondering why the high turnover, number one, I guess is what I'm saying. And the other question I have is why there was no external or internal search for a CIO. It seems to me that there should be better oversight and a plan in place to have the best qualified person in this position.
I'll attempt to answer that, Councillor. So we have had a succession of CIOs in the City of Ottawa. Our prior CIO, prior to Mr. Carlucci taking on the acting assignment, was one of our longest serving. He was here for 26 months. Strong IT leadership skills are a commodity that's sought by many corporations. It's actually fairly rare. We were fortunate to have Mr. Bashir for 26 months, and I can tell you, after doing a worldwide search, the City of Seattle basically poached him from us to become their Chief Technology Officer. And I think we benefited greatly from his employment with the City of Ottawa, and Mr. Carlucci is continuing on with the same work plan, with the same objectives that Mr. Bashir had in place. I can't help that technology is an industry where there's a high turnover in, and especially at the senior leadership level. The City of Ottawa, by comparison, doesn't pay perhaps as well as private sector does, and I'm certain Mr. Bashir is making a heck of a lot more money in Seattle than he was here, so it's hard for us to keep them in place. But what we've done in interim, though, is when Mr. Bashir came in, was he made certain that he had a management team in place that was there in the event that he would leave his position, that management team would be able to continue on, that they wouldn't be rudderless. The development of the OKRs is one of the prime tools to make certain that happens, because those OKRs are for a 3-year period, and so they continually work on those, they continually evaluate their progress toward them. So the fact that we've had a lot of turnover, prior to 2016, I can't really speak about that, but since 2016, we've had fair stability there, and we've put in a structure that we think prevents the city from being at risk should we lose a CIO.
I thank you for that. My follow-up would be that first of all, I want to thank you for your due diligence in filling in this position. But
I just want to point out Mr. Carlucci, acting CIO, and Mr. Fulton, I believe, security. Your
Manager of Technology Security.
Manager of Technology Security. Thank you.
We thank you for your work. But will the description of the CIO be reevaluated to further define what appropriately qualified and experienced CIO means? That doesn't seem to be adequately spelled out.
So your job description, which identifies the qualifications we're looking for, is at the senior leadership level is more or less a guideline. What you're really looking for is someone who's going to fit into your organization and be able to make effective change. Mr. Bashir was a known entity. He had been working for the city as the Director of Economic Development. The city manager knew him very well, knew his capabilities. He was the right person at that time to make that significant change in IT. So will we change the criteria? I don't think we will, but I will tell you, management reserves the right every time it's hiring at the senior level to make certain that despite what's on the paper, that is the person that is most suitable for the job from a fit perspective.
Are we actively looking for the best qualified person now to permanently fill this position?
So just a brief update on that. When the decision was made that with my departure that the Corporate Services Department is actually going to be split into two and combined with Service Innovation and Performance Development, and there will be a new GM in place, the decision was made by the city manager that only when the new GM is in place will the search for a new CIO begin, because that person needs to be involved in that decision-making process. We are in the process right now of hiring a new GM of the Innovative Client Services Department. That person is expected to be in place most likely in July or August, and at that time, that will be the first thing on their agenda is to commence the searches both for a new CIO and also the city solicitor position.
Are we discussing I don't know, the proper amount of authority and compensation to attract the best candidates? We don't really want to continue to have a revolving door. So, given the I guess the circumstances out there right now, it might be in our best interest to try to do something to keep
We always look at that as part of when we're trying to attract talent, but I can say that and this speaks to the issue of succession planning in this organization. In 2016, when I inherited the IT department, I can tell you there was a total of 0 employees who would have stepped forward to be the CIO. I can tell you I had my choice of candidates for the acting position. There are a number of internal candidates who are now interested because of the succession planning we've done to make certain that they have the skills to be able to step forward. that would be interested in the position. But yes, Councillor, we always look at the compensation. Unfortunately, we're a public sector. There's limits on what we can do. But yes, if we had an external candidate who had a compensation requirement that was above what we are able to provide, we would, and that was the person we thought was the best fit, we would certainly strive to find a way to accommodate that.
Okay. I want to thank you for that. Thank you.
Caroline, that's it. Councillor Sudds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So two issues I want to ask a few questions on this particular IT governance follow-up audit. First, I'll follow on to Councillor Meehan's issue around the role of the CIO. I think as a city, I would like to see us aspire to have someone in that role for more than 26 months. I come from this world in a past life. I understand it's a very unique skill set. The ability to pay is tough in this setting. However, I believe it is a very, very critical role in our city and in this organization. I've asked some questions in the past, and I think they're still valid now, around whether we have the right structure in place, whether we are setting up this individual for success and having a seat at the executive table, whether it is a CIO versus a CTO role is another, I think, very valid question, and I know there's some work underway looking at models of other cities. But having said that, from a governance perspective, I have some very serious concerns around the seemingly short stay of that position. And I think that we need to be addressing those concerns as we move forward with this plan, whatever it may look like. Addressing some of the other items that were raised as outstanding, I'm curious if staff can circle back or provide comments as to where they're at on the outstanding items. And we've addressed the CIO one, but the others, and whether that's being reflected in the IT roadmap or where that report will come back.
Thank you, Chair. With respect to that question, as the CIO, I've taken ownership of these audits. They are very important that we complete them. We've put a lot of work into those particular audits. With regards to the governance, 3 of the ones that are partial relate to the CIO. There's 2 additional ones that are partial. And as part of the rating with the OAG, if you're not 100%, you don't get a complete. You basically get a not complete. We put a lot of work into place with that, and we feel that I've put the right resources into it. When I found out about the audits, I quickly got myself up to speed on all 3 audits. I ensured that they were as part of our work plan after the auditor left in 2018. They were still part of our work plan in 2018. They are part of our work plan in 2019. I have the right resources. They are dedicated to those particular resources. I met with my management team. I told them this is a top priority. If Chris Fulton, as the manager of security, or Bev Givas, the manager of technology solutions, comes here with regards to some of the audit work, we have to make this a top priority because we all agree that we want to get it completed. And the management team as a whole was behind me for that support. So I have a lot of confidence that the 2 remaining items with regards to the risk management moving upwards, we have made those updated documentation in our documentation and will be complete by the end of the year.
And will those come to ITSC? Is that reflected in the IT roadmap and will be reported back to committee?
We will be presenting our work plan at the next IT subcommittee, and we can have a further discussion if the members and the chair would like about where we are with all of these audits. So there were 5 incompletes. Mr. Carlucci is speaking about 2 of them that are almost complete. The remaining 3 revolve around the issue of the CIO, his qualifications, and his performance objectives, and the succession planning. And Unfortunately, I can't say that we agree with the auditor's conclusions on those. So the city manager, as part of his role, will be looking at just exactly what you said, Councillor Sudds, around what is the appropriate structure to have in place, and do we want to consider a CTO versus a CIO, and all of those, whether it's at the senior leadership table, et cetera.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if we need
Councillor
I'm just wondering if we need a direction to make sure that we'll follow up at IT subcommittee with the follow-up, and so we can.
The chair is here, and he's listening to the discussion very attentively. So I'm assuming that we will be having this discussion at IT subcommittee.
Thanks. And just to confirm that I have spoken with the city manager about the IT subcommittee, playing an active role in making sure that the items that have been identified by the auditor continue to be followed up. So we don't need to necessarily wait for the auditor. We'll be seeking answers from staff about their progress at IT subcommittee as well. I'm keen for us to be a part of a productive part of the conversation.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you. I'm quite aware that there's an overall shortage of IT expertise out there, very much. And I'm wondering about our counterparts in other cities. Again, this is obviously something that they're probably dealing with too. Do we have any information about that in terms of comparing ourselves, in terms of their ability to hold on to IT experts? Because I'm sure that it's probably a common problem since it's an industry-wide situation.
Mr. Chair, maybe I could answer first, and that is that I've been in touch with a number of CIOs at a number of municipalities in Ontario, and a number of municipalities have not seen the turnover that we see here.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I was thinking in terms of raising it with FCM, in terms of, you know, this is something that we have to look at in the future, because obviously it's not just getting the person now, a CIO, but also just in terms of, you know, next steps of making sure we have replacements and we train people up for these positions. So I think if I think of us as an industry in terms of FCM, I think I'd make a recommendation that we look into that with them to build up the number of people who have these expertise.
Mr. Chair, the General Manager is absolutely correct. There is a shortage, but the point that I'm making is other municipalities have not seen the same turnover.
Okay,
that's what makes it so striking here, and that's why we raise it. Okay,
thank you.
If there's no other question, Vice Chair Meehan is asked to come back on the list.
Thank you. Just a follow-up to what Councillor Kavanagh was asking. The technology, as we know, is evolving so rapidly. It's hard to keep up with. I was reading an article on the weekend about the bad guys. We cannot in any way keep up with the bad guys. With the role of CIO, is there ongoing expertise and training and communications with, experts in the field about the risks, where the breaches could possibly happen, all that? Are we doing our due diligence in that respect so that you can be afforded of the best possible knowledge and the latest developments in hacking, or and in risk assessment and plugging those holes?
Yeah, that's one of the major challenges that we face, is keeping up with the evolving threats. They're becoming more sophisticated, as you mentioned, and more tailored and targeted to us. They do their research before they basically try and attack us. So, yeah, it's been a constant stay in touch with industry trends. We subscribe to a number of services so that we're aware of the evolving threats. We have strong partnerships with CGI, our managed security service provider, and with Microsoft. We rely heavily on their threat intelligence. We talk to our peers within Canada and make sure that we have a good pulse on what we're trying to protect the city's information from. I'm confident with all the work that we've done on staying on top of the evolving threats and the defense mechanisms that we have put in place.
Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Auditor General, when like this is a theme in your audit and the follow-up is the role of the CIO and how critical it's been that we haven't had a steady CIO. Is part of your review, did you see if there was any exit interviews done as a normal practice with senior managers especially? There should have been some sort of an exit interview done. Was there any theme in those interviews as to why we're losing?
Mr. Chair, we did the, this of course is the follow-up, and when we did our audit a number of years ago, it wasn't a common practice to conduct exit interviews, and we did not check to see if there were exit interviews for the purpose of this follow-up.
So maybe, Madam Treasurer, if you'd like to comment on that. You know, I know that you maybe can't give us the content of any of the interviews that were done. What I'm looking for is whether or not there was some kind of theme as to why we're losing our CIOs.
I can speak to the last CIO, who I did do an exit interview for. So Mr. Bashir is now the Chief Technology Officer in Seattle, and has a budget of $277 million and 680 employees, and probably 3 times the salary he has now. So that was the reason why he left. He was poached. Prior to that, we had 2 CIOs who actually retired, and I can say that the most successful CIOs we've had in this corporation have actually been the internal ones. Every time we've brought in someone from the outside, it's been a struggle because the culture at the City of Ottawa is different than the private sector, and it's different than the federal government. But I did not conduct interviews with the previous CIOs when they left, but I'm aware that in some cases it was just simply they were planning on retiring, but in some cases it was just because they were not the right fit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Leeper, please.
Thanks, Chair. One of the themes, I guess, of what we're discussing this morning is people and their development and their retention. And one of the things that I found changed a lot between the last term of council and this term of council, and a lot of it is due to SAD, and now I know Sandro is keeping that going, is a bigger focus on developing our people in the IT department, and particularly of giving them the opportunity to develop new capacities, to find taxpayer savings through developing new skill sets, the kind of work that keeps people wanting to work for the City of Ottawa. I don't have that complete list of everything we've done, but I was wondering if perhaps Marion could address her perspective on some of the shifts that have taken place within the IT department from the top on down to do a better job of retaining people from the top to everybody in the organization.
Certainly. So one of the big initiatives that SAD did put in there was to develop his own people. Well, we have very limited money in the City of Ottawa to ensure training, but IT is an area that needs constant training because that is changing so rapidly. So one of the tools that he was able to implement, it's at a very cost-effective price, was an online platform called Pluralsight, and I don't have the latest numbers of how many hours of training we've taken, but if I recall, for 2018, it was well over 2,000 hours of training. So staff can go on, we find they go on in evenings and weekends, they can go online and get training on IT areas that are evolving. There's thousands of training items on that platform. In addition to that, we looked at all of the staff and looked at where they wanted to progress and came up with learning and development plans for them. We have defined a number of areas where we require certifications, and we've outlined to staff, if you want to go and get a certification in this particular area, we're willing to pay for, in most cases it requires a fee to take the exam, but for the training beforehand, so we've established certifications. We've also, and one of the most, I think, beneficial things that Mr. Bashir was able to do and we're continuing with is we have connections with major technology companies in the rest of Canada and the United States, and we've been able to bring our employees to those areas. For example, I believe it was Microsoft, we were able to bring 2 employees to our management team, and they were able to basically shadow some of the executives in that high-tech company for a week to learn how they're doing things. So it's not only is it course learning, but it's online learning, it's shadowing, it's understanding where our employees want to be. And I think as a result, they've actually been able to, people see their progress in this corporation and are willing to stay longer because they know they're going to continually be upgraded as we move forward.
I think we have some of our employees who have had the opportunity to learn new skills on working with some of our biggest vendors, and who even have the opportunity now to talk to other municipalities about some of the work that they've been doing, and to try to lead the way or to talk to other municipalities about the cost savings that they've been able to find. We don't rely in a situation where staff have learned to do it themselves as much on consulting dollars, which are very expensive. People are learning how to do it with taxpayer savings and a more compelling workplace.
That's absolutely correct, Councillor. We were able to, in 2017, we came forward with a report that basically reduced our consulting budget and transferred those dollars into compensation. At basically you'd cut 100% of your consulting and you only need a third of it for staff, because that's basically what consultants cost versus a staff person. But in addition to that, I can say we are seen as leaders in a lot of areas around that. A prime example of that is when we upgraded from our SAP platform last year. We did that completely with our own resources. That's almost unheard of in the industry. And we did it because staff were able to have the appropriate training beforehand. We only used the consultants basically to come up with an overall plan and guide us, but it was staff who did the work, and that is something that I think the City of Ottawa should be pretty proud of, because it basically saved us hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And that's difficult to write into a job description for the CIO.
Very much so.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
I appreciate that you brought it back to the issue of governance, and thank you, Madam General of the IT Department, and Madam General Manager, thank you for your comments. I just want to point out, while you mentioned fit and leadership and a change agent as important characteristics of a new permanent CIO, and I recognize that, I think what you've heard from others is that there are some skills and education and experience that are important, and you've mentioned that you are developing those skills within our internal candidates, and that is an important source of recruitment and retention of recruitment for the new CIO, and so if I simply wanted to emphasize that. Mr. AG, did you want to
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to say that I think it's excellent that that the penny has dropped, and that a change has come about. The 2 individuals that were brought in to do the original audits and to do the follow-up audits were struck by the lack of certifications in some areas, and I think it's excellent that IT has changed their approach and is has begun to encourage certifications, because that's one area where they were certainly lacking, and maybe that contributed to some of the turnover. That's not for me to say or to deny, but I think this will certainly all contribute to a better atmosphere moving forward.
And I appreciate that, and I recognize in your assessment it is an incomplete recommendation, and you've used the word certification. There is independent certification, and I'm sure our senior leadership management team has made note of that, and that there will be further discussion on this. And that is, if there's no other questions, on to you, Mr. Auditor General, with the audit of IT risk.
Thank you. So as we just spent the last little while talking about, technology is critically important, and it's an integral part of the operations of the city. And with that technology comes risk. And we find, and this is with any organization, including municipalities, that there's an inherent risk relating to IT in virtually every activity and function at the city. Based on our audit in 2015, our assessment indicated a low level of maturity in most city departments for IT risk management. We found this to be mainly due to governance and leadership issues such as high CIO turnover, as well as the authority, the scope, and the span of the CIO across the organization. At the time of our audit, the city had not developed a standalone IT risk management framework with governance, including clear responsibilities and accountabilities for city management that would be capable to support a mature risk culture. In our original audit as well, we found that the city did not have a full inventory of the IT universe across the city in order to identify IT risks. As well, there was no complete risk register that was developed with input from trained and qualified IT professionals. This is a significant risk, as there were and still are several departmental IT groups which operate fully or in part independently from ITS. In addition to these independent IT groups, there were a number of examples at that time where business lines had acquired third-party applications or leveraged cloud-based solutions for their business without ITS's involvement. The risk to the city, to the extent these applications or solutions would access city computers, use city networks, or otherwise connect to the city infrastructure, presents significant risk if unmonitored, unchecked, or unknown. Without a complete, documented, and comprehensive inventory of all IT components and applications that rely on the city's IT infrastructure, it is not possible to build a risk register that identifies all these risks and would identify potential requirements for corrective action. As well, with respect to the original audit, we found that the CIO's authority and ability to influence and manage IT resources was found to be limited, as staff responsible for IT in various departments and agencies were not accountable to the CIO, and lines of authority were not always clear. As well, the CIO's authorities and responsibilities for citywide IT risks were not formally defined. And finally, with respect to training and skill sets, it was found that in some areas, people with little or no technical training were being tasked with the identification of risks or related mitigation strategies. The assessment that we conducted in our follow-up work found that of the 8 recommendations, our assessment concluded that 8 of these recommendations were partially complete, and there was one that we were unable to assess. We found that policies for governance had been aligned with the goals of the city's enterprise risk management framework, but the annual risk validation process, which is a key process in the IT risk management framework, was still being developed at the time of the audit. It had originally been expected to be complete at the end of 2016. In the updates shown in our report, it was then updated to be completed at the end of 2018, but remains incomplete. Roles and responsibilities have become more clearly defined with the introduction of the IT risk management framework. However, we've noted that the city's current IT risk policies and processes have inconsistencies with respect to approval requirements when there are exemptions or exceptions to standard procedures. And what this means is that in a risk management framework, when there are solutions, applications, or changes that go outside the standards, these are considered exceptions, where they identify risks that are potentially higher to the city. And there's a process where these are required to go to either the senior leadership team or the Technology Security Risk Management Committee for approval. We reviewed all the items that had been identified, and in our assessment and in looking at the policies and procedures that were in place, we had expected that they would have gone to these levels of approval. What we found instead was that they were approved at the CIO level or by the manager of IT security. In our report, we suggest that the potential issues with this process, that it needs to be revisited and ensure that there's clarity and consistency across the different policies. One example of this was with respect to an issue identified where there was going to be private resident information that would be stored out of country. And again, we saw that that didn't come to these committees for approval where we had expected based on the nature and the risk associated with it, that they would have been heard, explained, and then gone through approval with those committees. We further identified that some resources continue to lack formal risk training to assist with performing risk assessment responsibilities. We also found that the IT inventory universe has not been completed, and this would serve to support the identification of potential IT risks. This was due at the end of 2017. For the identification of IT risks for existing technology at the city, an attempt was made across 2 service areas out of 53 to assess risks of existing technology in place. The approach was then abandoned, and it was decided that a modified method would be used, which in our opinion, and we state this in our report, does not adequately address the recommendation or the underlying risks. When using this approach, coupled with an incomplete risk universe, the city may not properly identify all IT risks that do require assessment and potential mitigation. So those are the key elements that we wanted to highlight on this follow-up. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Vice Chair Meehan.
Thank you. Given the discussion we had previous to this presentation by the Audit Committee, we talked about training, and I came away from that discussion feeling that we had been doing a good job training and ensuring that our staff are up on the latest ways of mitigating risk. But I'm just wondering, I'm a little disturbed by these findings from the Auditor General's report, is that the training is not there, the knowledge is not there. So I would like to find out exactly when you expect that the staff will have the proper training to do this job, to mitigate the risk to the city.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We in technology security are one of the areas that we do a lot of formalized training. Every single person within my branch has technical certifications in security field and in risk. Where the Auditor General is referring to individuals not having expertise in risk assessments is on the BSS side in one of our processes doing validations of risks. We've since recognized that as an inconsistency.
Have you done something about it? Is it being worked on?
Yes, that we're addressing. So those BSSs, risk, they call themselves risk practitioners, don't do any identifications of risk. All risk, technical and technical security risk, is being assessed by a member of my team that has the proper training. And that's the way that it works right now with all the assessments that happen.
And just asking, Mary, is the senior leadership team following up on this?
Yes, I'm well aware of this. So part of what we do, because security is such a small group, is that We actually are looking to have security become something that's not just the responsibility of the 9 folks who work in Chris's area, but are something that's actually a responsibility of all of his colleagues in IT, and then it sort of cascades out from there. We were using, in order to advance this objective, the skill set or the talents of our business support services units in each department, but we were very careful that those people were actually not responsible for identifying and mitigating risks. That's actually always done under the supervision of somebody who is an accredited risk practitioner, so that we're having, we have confidence in the results that are coming out.
Well, you can call me naive, but this audit was brought down 4 years ago, and we're still working on this. And that worries me. Why is it taking so long to do this? I mean, a hacker can take, I don't know, it's minutes to breach our system. Yet we're still working on this 4 years later. I think this is unacceptable.
Yeah, as Sandro mentioned earlier, in order for us to get a complete on these recommendations, we have to have it 100% done. At the
Sorry,
time,
can you say, sorry, I missed that? You have to?
we have to have it 100% done. So in order to get a complete on these recommendations for risk management, we have to be 100% done. So when, at the time of this follow-up, what we're saying is 75% of the deliverables leading to completion of all of the recommendations for this report were complete. The reason why we weren't getting 100% done on some of them was as a result of 2 items in particular. One was the inconsistencies on the approval authority, and the other one was the annual validation process or exercise. That validation process was finalized in late 2018 after this assessment, and it was unable to assess at the time because we hadn't actually gone through one of the execution of that process, which is actually planned for Q4 of this year. So, you know, we have done significant foundational work to satisfy this audit. A couple of those things in particular are the well-established technology security risk management governance structure that we have in place that has been utilized to accept, approve, reject, deny risks, technology and technology security risks at the city. We also have, as was mentioned earlier, a framework that has been developed by certified risk practitioners, and that governs how we do our risk. We have supporting processes that actually feed into our risk register system that's been put in place. And that risk register system has been actually the biggest thing for us in managing our risks. It's fully automated. It takes input from our risk assessments templates, automatically loads it into the database. It alerts us when action items are due, which is something that we never had before. That in itself is a huge benefit for us to effectively manage risk here at the city.
Do you think it's satisfactory? I mean, if I were to hire a locksmith and after 4 years he'd only completed 75% of the work, is that acceptable? Because that's basically what we're being told here.
I think the work was Mr. Chair, the work was delayed as a result of a lot of the 2016 reorg that was happening within IT. I came into this role early in 2017, and when I did, SOG gave me a mandate letter that said, make these audits a priority. And from that point on, I developed a work plan, and significant work has taken place in both audits that are within my team through 2017 to 2018. And the validation process couldn't really be executed until we had significant risks populated within our risk register so that we could actually run through a validation exercise with our service areas.
I'll have to accept that because I'm not an expert, but thank you.
One additional item that I'd like to add, if that's okay, Mr. Chair, is I met with their technology solutions manager once I found out the status of these audits. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be assigning an internal project manager to help finalize a lot of these items. So a lot of work has been done. We're saying 75%, but in some areas it might even be more than 75%. As Mr. Fulton alluded to, with regards to the exceptions, the validations, and then the misunderstanding of the training with regards to BSS, it gave us an incomplete on all of our items. But a lot of work has been done. Security is very important in IT. As the CIO, that's one of the things that we talk about on a bi-weekly basis of management meetings team. We've had our OKRs, which is our work plan. We review it monthly. And one of the things that we do is we don't work in silos. Previously, before 2016, the applications did their work, security did their work, another area did their work. We work very closely well together, and we will reallocate the appropriate resources, just as we're doing with regards to Technology Solutions Manager. I'm asking, give me a PM to help me finish these audits. And I'm confident if we put that in place with the hard work that we've already done, and we take security really, really very seriously at our department, we will get these completed by Q4 2019.
Councillor Suds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Putting into context that this audit was done, I believe it was 2015, and we're now doing the follow-up. The IT landscape, obviously the risk landscape, has grown tremendously over that period of time. Of course, as taxpayers continue to demand services in more digital and other ways, how are you addressing that changing risk landscape? And is that reflected, as you've mentioned, the new risk assessment systems that you've put in place?
As all new projects and initiatives are run through technology solutions on intake, we're involved right from the beginning. So every single change, major change that takes place, a member of my staff with the client focus area looks at, reviews, assesses that change depending on the risk approach that we take with that certain change. Meaning how big is it? Is it bigger than a bread box? Is it small? We have different assessment methodologies that we use with each one of those circumstances. That information is now rolled up into our risk register. If there is any area that we feel that isn't being properly mitigated, that's where we engage the technical security risk management governance structure and ask for their approval. That's where we're now involving them. There was an inconsistency for a while where we weren't properly utilizing that, but that's now been addressed within our processes, and we are updating the framework to reflect that, and that framework will go up for approval very shortly to the TSRM for approval.
Okay. Does that framework address timelines, certain checkpoints where you will be referring back to that committee? It does?
Yes, it does. Like we have, as I mentioned earlier, action items that get flagged through the risk register system to say, this mitigation is due, or an exemption is due for a review. All of our exemptions are all based on the standards that we've recently updated with input from all of our technology branches within IT. They've had extensive input into development of those security standards. And everyone in IT is fully aware of what those are and how they relate to the policy. And that information, as I mentioned earlier, is rolled up in a dashboard form, and it will be presented to TSRM. We're now modifying our quorum for that engagement of that governance structure to meet on a quarterly basis to look at that risk profile now that we've been able to amass data within our risk register.
One other, maybe more point of clarification, because I think I missed. You were referring to the risk validation process and then further the evaluation process. And a comment that in the past there was a gap there in that some of that, the validation, or excuse me, a validation process was stopping at the CIO. So not getting the level of attention that it necessarily needed. So what is the measure that's been put in place now?
Right, so we have adjusted our processes to have what's called an approval criteria. And it's based on, at what level can I approve a risk, and what level the CIO can approve a risk, and then what goes to TSRM, and then eventually SLT. So that's the hierarchy, and we took quite a bit of an effort to properly define that within our exemption process. That is now just been incorporated into our risk management framework, and like I mentioned earlier, that will be going to approval for TSRM to approve it. We've been operating ever since the gap was identified by the auditor. We've modified our processes to now include the TSRM with all major high-risk approvals. We've actually got those documented now within our risk register, and we can see where the TSRM has approved most of the major ones that are in place within our register.
Who has visibility to the risk register?
We will provide, like I mentioned, dashboard reports to TSRM on a quarterly basis, and we can certainly provide that rolled up information to IT subcommittee.
Okay, that'd be terrific. I think, as this discussion evolves, the need to ensure, first of all, accountability, but second of all, transparency to those risks, which we all bear, I think is incredibly important. So I'll certainly watch for that at ITSC. Thank you.
Councillor Shantiri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that was a good question from my colleague. The question we heard time and time again, neither level of government invests enough in managing security. I mean, we heard from some of the colleagues, the hacker can always be one step ahead. Is it because it's lack of investment? Like, all what we're talking here is about managing risk, but not stopping. So is it fair to say we're not investing enough? Neither any level of government in Canada actually spend enough on that. I'm just trying to shed some light on a real story.
Thank you, Chair. We invest in technology security solutions. We look at world-class solutions that are put in place. Our budget has actually increased from 2017 to 2019. We put a bigger emphasis on that. For us, that is money well spent. We do look at, as I mentioned, the best in breed. We've put in significant improvements in having those solutions available for us that can help us with regards to some of these risks that are out there.
And just to add to that, we do employ industry best solutions in a number of our defense layers. So we have what's called depth in defense. Many layers, if one layer doesn't catch it, the other layer will pick it up. And like I mentioned, we have a lot of, they're all industry best solutions in a number of areas. We don't like to discuss in a public forum what those particular defense mechanisms are, but we do have a lot of industry best practices ones.
I understand where you're going with this, but my question is, if other level who you depend on for their filter, for their assistance, they're not making enough investment in that field. So that means you're going to be short on your end as well. That's what I'm trying to connect it, because we hear time and time again, Canada is one of the lowest spending country when it comes to cybersecurity.
As Saad mentioned, or Sandro mentioned earlier, we have increased our budget. I think it was it 25% we calculated over the past 2 years to help with making sure we're monitoring our technology ecosystem properly, meaning everything that, that IT looks after on behalf of the city. So we have strong partnerships with CGI, as mentioned earlier, and Microsoft. Now with the Office 365 program, where we're taking advantage of a number of very key security components from that whole contract that we've taken on with Microsoft. And one other one that I should mention that's very, very important, with the recent wire transfer fraud that was presented not too long ago, our branch was commended for our incident response plans, and we also have, as a part of that, implemented a cybersecurity awareness training program corporate-wide. And I just checked the numbers yesterday. We have 3,500 employees that have taken that training and made themselves aware of our policies and standards. And it is mandatory. We will get to full completion, and we're planning on having all staff have that training completed by the end of July.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you. Under recommendation number 4, it talks about, you know, working with the different departments, and there's obviously big differences in each department. Is it possible, and maybe it's already in effect, or hopefully it is having department by department, having lieutenants in each department, where you have an IT person who is the go-to person in each department, so that you can all meet together and talk because of the differences, because there is vast differences in each department, and as it's been pointed out, and sometimes it's different IT systems as well. Personally, I think it'd be an opportunity for succession planning if these people were developed, if we had people that were in departments. I should have said this earlier under the IT governance one, but I think there's opportunities here to work on equity issues as well, in terms of training up people. If we have people in these departments, perhaps we can, have them groomed up for bigger positions. But I see an opportunity there. Is that being done in terms of like having meetings with all the departments on IT issues specifically?
That's a good question. We have reps that focus on all the different client groups and service areas throughout the city. Technology Solutions Intake has a rep that deals with the key stakeholders within each one of those areas. We, like I mentioned earlier, that corporate-wide training program, that is corporate-wide, not just IT as well. So we maintain a strong relationship with all those different service areas, and that was a challenge for us to go out and then gather the risk information from those areas and incorporate it into our risk register.
But the staff is not right in the department. They're your staff just overlooking?
Councillor, if I could add something with respect to the training. One of the things that Mr. Bashir was very conscious of the fact is we do have what we refer to as federated partners, the major IT groups in the other departments that operate their own systems that are just their own systems. He wanted those people to be as up-to-date as our IT people. So our Pluralsight, our online training platform, he bought licenses so that all of those members in the federated partners could also participate in online training to keep their skills up to date. So there is an understanding that the role that IT plays is also has to influence what our federated partners do as they set the standards. But we want to make certain that they're up to speed and have the skill sets and know what's going on in IT on a regular basis.
That's very helpful, but I'm wondering if it's necessary to even actually have an employee who's from your department regularly working inside these departments, not just overseeing, but actually going in there to work on the culture changes. And it is an opportunity, and training is really important, and that we keep training them up. But if we're talking about the succession planning and building up not just for the CIO, but just in terms of generally. I hope that we'll take that as an opportunity.
Thank you, Councillor, and not seeing any other questions, just to pick up on, I apologize. Go ahead.
Just one brief one. You mentioned the wire fraud, and I guess this question goes to our solicitor. Do we know how much money, or can you say how much money has been recovered from that incident earlier, from last year?
Is that subject of this,
Well, they just,
Mr. Solicitor?
Mr. Chair, I'll just say no money has been recovered. We are still working with the victim services in the United States over that particular matter, and I will undertake to provide this committee with an update as soon as I have one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Picking up on what Councillor Kavanagh said, and I'd just like to understand a little bit better from IT and from the Auditor General, the governance of risk and how, and the importance of having the IT service department as the overseer with respect to evaluating and mitigating risk versus decentralized policies that reside within departments. And how does that impact future risk? And I'd just like a comment first from the Auditor General with respect to the work that you've done on IT risk management in terms of a centralized, focused IT service department versus a decentralized, and the business service, the BSS departments within each segment of city ops.
There are certainly issues that we will talk about in camera, specifically. But we have talked about a central authority with responsibility for overall IT issues. In an organization with 17,000 people, $4 billion budget, it isn't rare to have other groups in other departments with a requirement for a strong IT presence. I mean, that model exists in many organizations. But you're correct. Without a single overriding authority over IT, that itself presents some risks. And when there are problems in the identification of risk and the management of those risks, as we identified in this particular initial audit report and in the follow-up, it makes it much more complicated when you have federated partners, I think is the term that IT uses, where you have limited control over what they can do. So there's no doubt it does increase risk, but certainly the first piece in our mind is to identify a single overriding source for IT issues.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton, did you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have developed the IT risk management framework, which states that technology and technology security risk is owned by the CIO for all of the city. So it is that central authority. We have been working with what we do call our technology partners to ensure that they are following the same practices we are within IT. We've been working with them on developing their SCADA standards and on developing vulnerability and penetration testing plans of their environments, similar to practices that we do within our own environment.
And thank you for that. But and I acknowledge it. But in reading the report, Mr. Fulton and Mr. Carlucci, I'm not convinced that the ITS department has a good handle on all the risks within all the departments. I think the incomplete recommendations indicate that. And I think as you choose to mitigate or to accept risks or to find the resources to reduce the risks or to eliminate the risks as much as possible, you need to have a good inventory of those risks. And that is what has not been completed, or there's no evidence. And you have said, Mr. Fulton, that unless you get 100%, we have an incomplete. It's not like we're at 95% or just on the cusp. There is not all the recommendations are technical. Many are cultural change, leadership change. Not that there's not leadership here. I acknowledge that we've talked about the CIO turnover, but the vision and the leadership to mitigate those risks. And I hope that that is the message that you are receiving here. For example, you referred to penetration testing, and in reading the report, in the original report, how that is done and how efficient that is, and who you've employed to do that penetration testing is not clear, not to me, and I don't know if it is clear to other members of this committee, so that you can properly evaluate and mitigate or accept those risks. And so I'd like to see change on that. And I guess my question is now to the Auditor General, the 0 of 8 on the recommendations. Mr. Auditor General, they're serious and they're not complete. This is your follow-up audit. What further actions should we expect any further actions from you on this audit?
Mr. Chair, we generally do a follow-up audit, identify the level of implementation, and then move on. But as we've said here, and as we will say in camera, there are some issues that remain incomplete that are, in our view, serious. And yes, there are some disagreements in some areas, but there is acknowledgement by management that there are some that are incomplete by their own admission. Because of the seriousness of this function, because of the seriousness of some of the areas where the implementation is complete, management has told us that they would be complete by Q4 2019. What we would be prepared to do in this circumstances, because of the importance of the function and the areas left undone, we would be prepared to, when we go in to do a follow-up of remote access, which is another audit report that was done, and the follow-up is just coming due. We would follow up the balance of the recommendations that we now rate as incomplete. And then when we report back with the follow-up on remote access, we would also report back on hopefully we will be reporting back to say now all of these recommendations have been completely implemented.
Thank you. And to the ITS department, it's been a while it's been 4 years for these recommendations, and you spoke about investments in 2017 and 2018. Do you anticipate having the resources in 2019 and 2020 to fulfill the commitments that you've made to this committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. This is a top priority for the IT management team as well as for myself. I am taking ownership of these audits. One of the other items that I did do was I reached out to the OAG to ask if I can have a meeting to get a status, because I was very new to this, and they granted that meeting with me. And at that time, I expressed that I'd be very interested on a follow-up on the follow-up. So I would take that as well, because just to show the committee, this is very important to us. We have made a lot of work, and we want want to prove it that we have done this work, and you will see that the recommendations that have been provided, I think, are very good, some very good recommendations, and we always want to improve ourselves to try to be even a better organization than we already are. So I'm very comfortable that the work will be completed this year. I will make sure that the resources are available in order for us to complete it. As I mentioned, I'm going to get an internal IT project manager to help with that, to kind of just keep the lines going, keeping that profile for us. And as I mentioned, we also talk about it at our management monthly meetings, and this will be one of the topics that we'll talk about as well.
Thank you, Mr. Carlucci. And thank you all, colleagues, for your questions on this. We are now at still on item number 3, but audit number 6, and audit of IT security incident handling and response, and a short introduction by the Auditor General.
Mr. Chair, the final audit of the final follow-up of the 3 follow-ups that we did is the audit of IT security incident handling and response. And just overall, we can say that we assessed 6 of the 11 recommendations as fully implemented, with 4 partially implemented, and 1 that we were unable to assess. And our presentation will be in camera, and I think it's the appropriate time for us to go in camera.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Before we do that motion, Vice Chair Meehan has a direction to staff that is based on some of the questions that we've had today.
I do. Thank you, Chair. This is a verbal direction. I would like to direct the City Manager's Office to provide the Audit Committee with digital copies of the Audit Recommendation Tracking Report that is currently maintained by the City Manager's Office. And I'd like to receive this document by the end of the business day today or at the end of this week, whatever you can deliver.
Through the chair, we'll endeavor to respond to that certainly before the end of the week.
Okay. I also have a motion I'd like to introduce. Is that possible?
To resolve into camera?
No, right now.
You have a motion?
Yep, I do. Yeah. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. Whereas the Audit Committee has heard from city staff and the Auditor General regarding recommendation presented in the follow-up reports that we heard here today, whereas certain recommendations are considered complete by the Auditor General, and whereas sufficient time has elapsed, in some cases 4 or 5 years, to provide the Audit Committee with the reasonable expectation that all recommendations should be considered complete, therefore, be it resolved that the Audit Committee directs city staff to provide an update on all audit report recommendations heard here today, which are considered partially complete by the Auditor General at the next Audit Committee. So what the intent of this is to get an update on the work that has been going to be taking place on these recommendations before the next meeting.
Okay, the next meeting is not determined yet.
Sometime in July, is it?
We have anticipated. I don't know if that is, so I had not seen this motion,
No,
Vice Chair.
No, we just moved it.
And so the therefore again is?
Therefore, be it resolved that the Audit Committee directs city staff to provide an update on all audit report recommendations heard here today, which are considered partially complete by the Auditor General at the next Audit Committee meeting.
Are you referring to the ones for winter operations?
Yes, everything. Everything that was incomplete.
So follow-ups on
Yeah, follow-ups on the incomplete items.
A status report by staff.
That's, we're sitting at 56% completion rate in some cases after 4 or 5 years. I think that we need to put a deadline on completing these, and I'd like to see that happen sooner than later.
Okay, that's a motion. I believe that's a motion.
That's a motion.
Yeas and nays. Yeas and nays.
Okay.
Yeas and nays?
Yeah, yeas and nays.
Yes.
Did you have a, sure?
Yep. Anybody?
No, I'm not going to have a same, but I mean, follow-up on a follow-up. We already have this follow-up, and I think eventually the Auditor General will come back with the summary of all your audit. Am I correct? Like you will be coming back to tell us what's been standing and what's need to be complete. Like we don't want to waste more staff time where we need other audit to take place than go back and follow up on a follow-up. So we heard today, and staff agree some of the stuff has not been completed. They are willing to work on it. They are working on it. If the auditor feel within a year from now need to follow up on this, it's fine. But to have it by the next, I mean, it will be.
My understanding, I guess there's two comments that I make. One is what we said that we would do because of the importance of the IT incompletes. We would, when we're doing another follow-up, likely in late 2019, early 2020, we would also further follow up on the implementation of those incompletes. So that would be the IT incompletes.
Sorry.
My understanding of what was just read was that staff would come back to let the committee know their status on the incompletes. There would be no work required by us. Am I correct?
This is the risk when we have a motion on the fly without even have staff look at it, other look at it. So what's the staff, this motion, what does it mean to IT staff?
All of the audit deliverables that are outstanding are still a part of our OKR, which is our objective and key results. That's a part of our work plan. We can present those to the IT subcommittee, the status on the completion of those. So that can be accomplished through that mechanism if need be. We will definitely welcome the opportunity to go through a second follow-up to prove that to this committee and IT subcommittee that we will get full completion by the end of this year.
By the end of this year, not by the next meeting. Okay.
A progress report on those recommendations, not just IT, but
Just,
all of the
okay. Councillor Elshine, Councillor Hubley, you wanted to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Councillor El-Shantiri. This may be a bit, especially if you're talking about all the different audit follow-ups today, to be asking for that before the next meeting. What I'd like to suggest, maybe as an amendment to your motion, Councillor, is you've given direction to Mr. Box to get back to you with the list of incomplete recommendations. How about we take that and maybe at the next audit meeting decide if we want to create a new report that's called incomplete recommendations or something like that, and just park this request for now till you get that information? Would that be a friendly suggestion?
Well, I like that, but at the same time, many of these recommendations are 4 or 5 years past due. I think it's just incumbent on us to keep on top of this and figure out, we've heard a lot of promises here today. I think that 6 audits, going to 6 departments to get an update on the progress they're making on the promises that they made today to complete the tasks or the recommendations isn't asking a lot.
It's whether the follow-up, if I just wrap that up, what you're explaining there is the follow-up on the recommendations of the follow-ups. In the case of the IT stuff, that would really flow. I just saw him come back in the room here, the chair of the IT committee. Wouldn't they be the ones to be doing the follow-up on what's the remaining work? Because it's going to be part of their work plan. It shouldn't be part of the audit committee's work plan. We've shown the recommendations. The AG provides the recommendations and observations of what he finds. It's then up to the departments and the various oversight committees to follow up past the follow-ups. Is that a fair assessment?
This is not a valuable tool then? I think this is not...
Okay. I'm suggesting we defer until we get to the
We'll put it to a vote in a minute, and I just have a few comments. The Vice Chair had directed the Deputy City Manager or the City Manager's office to provide a listing of all outstanding audits from from time immemorial, and he has committed to endeavor to get that to us by the end of the week, I believe were his words, number one. Number two, the Auditor General has said that he will be doing a follow-up on especially the IT risk management, given that there are 8 incomplete recommendations, and I appreciate that, and we will get that. I didn't write down when we would get that.
Well, first of all, we're just talking about the 3 IT follow-ups, and we would do it with another follow-up.
Remote access.
Remote access, and if staff indicates that they would have all of the outstanding items complete by the end of 2019, then we wouldn't start that work until the end of 2019. So. Okay.
And so on that basis, I will not be supporting the motion by the Vice Chair. Yeas and nays, please.
Councillor Derouz?
Oh, sorry.
No.
Councillor El-Shantiri?
No.
Councillor Hubley?
No.
Councillor Kavanagh?
Yes.
Vice Chair Meehan?
Yes.
And Chair?
No.
2 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you. But we will still get the report by the Deputy City Manager. Vice Chair has a motion to revolve into closed session.
Sorry. That in accordance with the Procedure Bylaw 2019-8, the Audit Committee revolve in camera pursuant to subsection 13(1)(a), the security of the property of the city, based upon the rationale set out in the legal implications section of the report titled Office of the Auditor General, Report on Audit Follow-ups, and Detailed Audit Follow-ups Report, in order to receive from the Auditor General the follow-up to the 2015 Audit of Information Technology Security Incident Handling and Response.
Is that carried? Carried. Thank you. Back in 5 minutes.